Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Raymond Nakamura, and I've been a park ranger at Katmai National Park in Alaska for 20 years. 20 years of watching over one of the most dangerous places on Earth, the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. Most people think being a ranger means helping tourists find bathrooms and warning them about bears. Here in Katmai, it means something else entirely. The valley got its name after the 1912 Novarupta eruption, when thousands of steam vents turned this place into what looked like the surface of hell. Even today, the ground can melt your boots if you step in the wrong spot. Toxic gases rise from cracks in the earth. The temperature can hit 200 degrees just a few feet underground. This is my office. I grew up hearing stories from my grandmother about the old days, before the big eruption. She was half Japanese, half Alutiiq, the native people who lived here for thousands of years. The Alutiiq had stories about spirits called tunghak that lived in the volcanic fires, spirits that could walk through ash and flame like you or I walk through air. My grandmother always said the 1912 eruption didn't create the valley, it just woke something up that had been sleeping. I never believed those stories. I have a degree in volcanology from the University of Alaska. I understand gas emissions and thermal dynamics and seismic activity. When the ground shakes, it's not spirits dancing, it's tectonic plates shifting. When hot springs bubble up overnight, it's underground pressure, not magic. At least, that's what I thought until August of 1978. It started with Dr. Elena Martinez from the U.S. Geological Survey. She'd been coming to Katmai every summer for 5 years, studying the ongoing volcanic activity. Elena was tough, had to be, to work in a place where one wrong step could drop you into a sulfur pit. She knew the valley better than anyone except maybe me. That summer, Elena's team was using new infrared equipment to map heat signatures across the valley. The technology was cutting edge, could detect temperature differences from miles away, even through ash clouds. They were trying to predict where new thermal vents might open up. The trouble started on August 15th. I was checking the radio station that morning when Elena's voice crackled through, full of static from the volcanic interference. "Ray, you need to see this," she said. "We're getting readings that don't make sense." I drove my ATV to their research station, a cluster of weather-resistant tents about 2 miles from the main visitor center. Elena met me with a printout in her hands, her usually calm face creased with worry. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a thermal map covered in red and orange spots. "These are heat signatures from last night. See these areas?" She pointed to several human-shaped blobs scattered across the printout. Those are people-sized heat sources, moving through zones that should be over 300 degrees. I studied the map. The shapes were definitely human, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but they were in areas where no person could survive. "Equipment malfunction?" I suggested. "That's what I thought. But look," she handed me another printout from a different instrument. Same readings. And watch this. She pulled out a series of photos taken at different times throughout the night. The heat signatures had moved, walking across the ash fields in perfect formation like a group of hikers on a trail. "Could be animals," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. No animal lived in those thermal zones. Animals don't walk upright, Ray. And they don't move in straight lines like this. Elena's voice dropped lower. "There's something else. We've been picking up low-frequency vibrations in the ground, not seismic activity, something rhythmic. Like footsteps." I looked at the data again. The logical part of my mind searched for explanations. Instrument failure, atmospheric distortion. Maybe, even hoax, though Elena wasn't the type. But deep down, something cold was spreading through my chest. Something that reminded me of my grandmother's stories about spirits that walked through fire. "Where's the rest of your team?" I asked. "That's the other problem," Elena said. "Dr. Martinez hasn't reported in since yesterday evening. He took the mobile sensors to the North Quadrant to investigate these readings. Said he'd radio in every hour." She checked her watch. That was 18 hours ago. The North Quadrant was one of the hottest areas in the valley. Surface temperatures there regularly hit 150 degrees, and the ground was unstable. Steam vents could open up without warning, releasing gases that would kill you in minutes. It was no place to go alone, especially overnight. "Get on the radio," I said. "Call in a search team." But even as I said it, I knew we wouldn't find Dr. Martinez alive. Not if he'd been out there all night in that heat. And something else bothered me. Something about the way those heat signatures moved across Elena's readings. They weren't random, they were purposeful, like they were searching for something, or someone. The valley was quiet that morning, quieter than usual. Even the constant hissing of the steam vents seemed muted. The ash in the air was thicker too, creating a gray haze that made everything look ghostly. As I drove back to the ranger station to organize the search, I caught myself checking the rearview mirror more often than normal. I was starting to understand why the Alutiiq had so many stories about spirits in this place. When you're surrounded by a landscape that looks like the end of the world, when the ground itself can kill you and the air burns your lungs, it's easy to believe that something ancient and angry lives here. What I didn't know yet was that believing those stories might be the only thing that could save us. The search for Dr. Martinez began at dawn the next day. I led a team of 3 other rangers and Elena into the North Quadrant, following GPS coordinates from his last known position. We moved slowly, testing the ground temperature every few yards with infrared thermometers. In some spots, the reading hit 180 degrees just beneath the surface. "Stay on the marked path." I called back to the group. "Don't step anywhere you see steam rising." The landscape around us looked like another planet. Gray ash stretched in all directions, broken only by the dark mouths of thermal vents and the occasional twisted remains of trees killed by the 1912 eruption. The air shimmered with heat waves, making distant objects dance like mirages. We found Martinez's equipment first. His portable weather station sat abandoned next to a cluster of fumaroles, its instruments still running and recording data. But there was no sign of the man himself. "His readings stop here," Elena said, checking the digital display. "Last entry was 11:47 p.m. yesterday." I knelt next to the weather station, examining the ground around it. The ash was disturbed, but not in the way I'd expect from someone setting up equipment. There were marks, long, dragging lines leading away from the station toward an area of particularly active thermal vents. "Martinez," I shouted. My voice echoed off the rocky formations, then was swallowed by the constant hissing of escaping steam. No answer. Ranger Collins, a young guy who'd only been with us 6 months, pointed toward a ridge about 50 yards away. "What's that?" Something was sticking up from behind a pile of volcanic rock. As we got closer, I realized it was Martinez's backpack. But it wasn't just sitting there. It was embedded in a mound of fresh ash, as if it had been buried and then partially uncovered. "Jesus," Elena whispered. She was staring at something else. Next to the backpack, pressed into the ash, was a footprint. But it wasn't from any boot I'd ever seen. The print was human-shaped, but wrong, too long, too narrow, and the edges were scorched into the ash like it had been made by something incredibly hot. More disturbing, there were dozens of them, all leading in the same direction, deeper into the thermal field. "We need to follow these," Elena said. "No," I said immediately. "We don't. We mark this location and call for a helicopter extraction." But Ranger Harrison, our most experienced tracker, was already following the trail. "Ray, you need to see this," he called. The footprints led to a place I'd never seen before, despite 20 years in this park. It was a natural amphitheater formed by volcanic rock, with dozens of thermal vents arranged in what looked almost like a circle. Steam rose from each vent, creating a shifting wall of white mist that made it hard to see clearly. And in the center of the circle, something moved. At first I thought it was just the heat distortion playing tricks with my eyes, but as I watched, the shapes became clearer. There were figures in the steam, tall, thin, moving with a strange gliding motion that didn't look quite human. "Do you see them?" Elena whispered. Before I could answer, one of the figures turned toward us. Even through the steam and heat shimmer, I could make out its face, or what should have been a face. Instead, there was a hollow space filled with glowing orange light, like looking into a furnace. When it moved, Ash fell from its body like skin flaking away. The temperature around us spiked suddenly. My thermometer was reading 200 degrees, then 250, then the digital display just showed error symbols. The air itself began to burn my lungs. "Run," I said quietly. Then louder, "Everyone run." We stumbled back toward our vehicles, the superheated air making it hard to breathe. Behind us, I heard sounds that weren't quite human. A low moaning that seemed to come from the earth itself, punctuated by the crack and hiss of expanding rock. Collins tripped in time, fell, his hand landing on a patch of ash that should have been cool. He screamed and pulled his hand back, the flesh already blistering from burns. The ash where he'd touched was glowing red-hot. "They're following us," Harrison shouted. I turned back for just a moment and saw them. 3 figures made of ash and fire, moving across the superheated ground like it was a cool spring day. They left glowing footprints in their wake, and the air around them shimmered with such intense heat that it looked like they were walking through liquid mercury. We made it to the ATVs and didn't stop driving until we reached the ranger station. Even there, 5 miles away from the thermal field, the temperature felt wrong, too hot, too oppressive. Collins's hand was badly burned, but what bothered me more was what he kept saying as I bandaged it. "They were looking for something," he insisted. The way they moved, like they were searching. And when that one looked at us, he shuddered. It wasn't curious, it was angry. That night, I sat in my office going through reports from previous years, looking for anything similar. What I found made my blood run cold. Every summer, for the past 5 years, there had been incidents. Hikers reporting moving heat sources in the distance. Equipment failures in thermal zones where instruments registered impossible temperature spikes. And people, always experienced researchers or guides who knew the valley, who went missing in areas that should have been survivable. Dr. Martinez wasn't the first, he was just the latest. I picked up the phone to call headquarters in Anchorage, then put it down again. What would I tell them? That I'd seen creatures made of fire walking through a volcanic field? That something that shouldn't exist was hunting people in my park? Instead, I walked outside and looked toward the valley. Even at night, I could see the glow of thermal activity on the horizon. But tonight, there seemed to be more light than usual. Not the steady glow of hot springs, but moving lights, like torches being carried across the ash fields. My grandmother's words came back to me. The Tunghak don't like it when strangers disturb their home. They'll warn you once, maybe twice. After that, they'll take you down into the fire with them. I thought about Dr. Martinez, about his equipment abandoned and his backpack buried in the ash, about those footprints that burned themselves into the ground. The Tunghak had given us their warning. The attacks began 3 days later. I'd managed to convince my supervisors to temporarily close the North Quadrant to researchers, citing unstable thermal activity. It was a lie, but not entirely. The temperature readings from that area had been spiking randomly, sometimes hitting levels that should have been impossible without a major eruption. Elena had stayed on despite my suggestions that she leave. "I've got 5 years of research in this valley," she said. "I'm not walking away because of some instrument glitches and superstition." But it wasn't superstition anymore. Every night, the moving lights in the thermal fields grew brighter and more numerous. Every morning, we found new evidence. Scorched footprints in areas we'd thought were empty. Vegetation burned away in patterns that looked almost like symbols. Equipment left in safe zones that turned up missing or destroyed. The first direct attack happened to a geological survey team from the University of Alaska. Professor Williams and 2 graduate students were taking core samples from an area that should have been safe. A low-temperature zone where the ground stayed around 80 degrees. They were experienced, well-equipped, and careful. Elena and I found what was left of their camp the next morning. The tents had been melted from the inside out, as if someone had poured molten lava over everything. Their equipment, metal instruments designed to withstand extreme temperatures, was twisted into shapes that looked almost artistic, like sculptures. And in the center of the destroyed camp, burned into the rocky ground, was a perfect circle about 20 feet across. The temperature required to do this, Elena said, running her infrared gun over the melted remains. "We're talking about 2,000 degrees, minimum. That's lava temperature." I was studying the ground around the circle. There were footprints everywhere, but they weren't random. They formed patterns, spirals leading to the center, then straight lines radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. And every print was burned so deep into the rock that they looked permanent. "Where are the bodies?" I asked. That was what bothered me most. 3 people couldn't just disappear. Even if they'd been caught in some kind of thermal event, there should have been remains. Bones don't just vanish, even at extremely high temperatures. Maybe they escaped, Elena suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. We found Professor Williams 2 hours later, or what was left of him. He was half a mile from the camp, sitting against a boulder as if he'd been resting. But when we got closer, we realized he wasn't sitting, he was fused to the rock. His body had been subjected to such extreme heat that his clothes and flesh had partially melted and then cooled, bonding him permanently to the volcanic stone. His face was intact enough to show his expression. His eyes were wide open, staring at something we couldn't see, and his mouth was stretched in what might have been a scream, or might have been wonder. "We need to evacuate the valley," I told Elena. "All researchers, all visitors, everyone." "Based on what? How do we explain this?" She was right. How do you tell people that the Earth itself has come alive and is hunting human beings? How do you write a report saying that creatures made of fire and ash are protecting their territory by burning intruders alive? But the decision was made for us that evening. I was in the radio room, trying to reach the graduate students who'd been with Professor Williams when the emergency beacon started going off. Someone in the South Quadrant was calling for help. "Ranger emergency frequency." "This is Nakamura," I responded. "What's your location and situation?" The voice that came back was barely recognizable as human. It was Ranger Peterson, a 10-year veteran who'd been checking thermal activity near Mount Griggs. "Ray? Oh God, Ray, they're everywhere. The whole valley is moving. The ash is alive." Static filled the radio for several seconds. Then Peterson's voice came back, higher and more desperate. "They came up out of the ground, just rose up like they were made of steam and fire. My thermometer is reading 500 degrees, but I'm not burning. They're not trying to kill me, Ray. They're trying to change me. Peterson, get to your vehicle and head for the main road. Do you copy? I can feel it happening, my skin. It's not burning, but it's changing, getting harder. And I can see things, Ray. I can see what they see. The valley the way it was before the eruption, when it was their home, beautiful and alive, and..." The transmission cut to static. I tried raising Peterson for 20 minutes, but got no response. When I finally reached the South Quadrant at dawn, I found his ATV empty, still idling next to a cluster of thermal vents. His equipment was scattered around the vehicle, but Peterson was gone. Almost gone. I found his uniform about 50 yards from the ATV, neatly folded and stacked on a flat rock. But it wasn't empty. There was still something inside it. When I got closer, I realized it was ash. Fine, gray ash that had somehow held the shape of a human body. When the wind hit it, the ash scattered, leaving behind only empty clothes and the smell of sulfur. That night, Elena and I were the only people left in the valley. Everyone else had been evacuated under the guise of increased volcanic activity. We sat in the ranger station, watching infrared monitors that showed the thermal fields around us. The screens were full of moving heat signatures. Dozens of them, all human-shaped, all walking in formation across the ash fields. They were surrounding us, getting closer with each sweep of the sensors. "We should leave," Elena said. "They won't let us," I replied. And somehow, I knew it was true. At midnight, they reached the ranger station. The temperature inside began to climb, 90 degrees, then 100, then 120. Outside, through the windows, I could see them. Tall figures that looked human from a distance but wrong up close. Their skin had the texture of cooled lava, black and cracked with red light glowing from within. When they moved, small pieces flaked off and crumbled to ash. But their faces were the worst part. They had faces, human faces that I recognized. Professor Williams, Dr. Martinez, the 2 graduate students, Ranger Peterson, all of them looking at us through the windows with expressions of infinite sadness and infinite patience. Elena was crying. "They're not dead," she whispered. "They've been changed, converted into something else. One of them, the one that had been Dr. Martinez, approached the window closest to where I stood. When he opened his mouth to speak, steam escaped instead of words. But somehow, I understood what he was trying to say. Asterisk, join us. The fire doesn't hurt anymore. The heat becomes part of you. You can see what we see now, the real valley, the one that exists beneath all this destruction. Asterisk, I looked at Elena. The temperature in the station was approaching 140 degrees. We were sweating, struggling to breathe. But we weren't burning. Not yet. They were giving us a choice. The truth came to me in pieces as the heat continued to rise. Standing there, looking into the faces of people who'd been transformed into something between human and elemental force, I finally understood what we were dealing with. The Tunghak weren't just spirits from Alutiiq folklore. They were real, and they were the original inhabitants of this valley, not the human inhabitants, the geological ones. Consciousness that had formed in the volcanic fires over thousands of years, shaped by heat and pressure and time into something that could think and feel and protect what it considered home. The 1912 eruption hadn't created them. It had awakened them. And now, after decades of sleeping, they were finding their valley invaded by creatures who treated their home like a laboratory. Humans who stuck instruments into their sacred fires, who walked across their skin of ash and stone like they owned it. The transformed researchers around our station weren't victims, they were converts. The Tunghak had offered them a choice: leave and never return, or stay and become part of the valley's living ecosystem. Those who stayed were changed, given new bodies that could survive in the thermal environment, new senses that could perceive the volcanic landscape as it truly was. But they were still human enough to remember what they'd lost. That's why their faces showed such sadness. Elena, I said, my voice hoarse from the superheated air. We need to get to the thermal monitoring station. What? Why? The seismic equipment. If I'm right about what these things are, they're not just spirits. They're part of the volcanic system itself, connected to it, maybe controlled by it. Elena's eyes widened as she understood. You want to trigger an eruption? No, I want to communicate. The thermal monitoring station was a quarter-mile from the ranger station, across open ground that was now crawling with the transformed figures. But they didn't try to stop us as we ran. They just watched, their glowing eyes tracking our movement like searchlights. The monitoring station was a small concrete building filled with seismic equipment, gas sensors, and communication gear linked directly to the volcanic early warning system. If the Tunghak were truly connected to the valley's geological activity, this was the place to reach them. I started working on the seismic transmitter, adjusting the frequency to send vibrations directly into the bedrock. Elena watched the door, where more of the transformed figures were gathering. Ray, whatever you're planning, do it fast. I count at least 20 of them out there. I found the right frequency, a low pulse that would travel through solid rock for miles. Then I began tapping out a message in the simplest code I could think of. Morse code, transmitted as rhythmic vibrations through the stone itself. We understand, we will leave. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the ground beneath us began to vibrate in response. Not the chaotic shaking of an earthquake, but a deliberate pattern. A rhythm that sounded almost like speech. And suddenly, I could hear them. Not with my ears, but somewhere deeper. Voices that spoke in the language of moving stone and flowing magma, telling the story of a place that had been alive long before humans arrived. They showed me the valley as it had been before 1912. Not the barren ash field I knew, but a complex ecosystem where different forms of consciousness existed in harmony. The thermal vents weren't just geological features, they were breathing holes for something vast and ancient that lived in the molten rock below. The hot springs weren't just water heated by underground fires, they were circulatory systems carrying information and energy through a living landscape. Then came the eruption, and with it, a long sleep. When they finally awakened, they found their home invaded by creatures who didn't understand what they were damaging. Every core sample was a wound. Every thermal probe was an intrusion. Every scientific measurement was a violation of something sacred. But they didn't want to kill us. They wanted us to understand. The temperature in the monitoring station had reached 160 degrees. Elena was on her knees, struggling to breathe. I could feel my skin beginning to blister, but I also felt something else. An invitation. a warm presence pressing against my consciousness, offering to take away the pain, to give me new senses that could appreciate the beauty of this volcanic world. All I had to do was stop fighting the heat, let it change me, become part of something larger than myself. For a moment, I was tempted. The offer felt genuine, even loving. These beings weren't evil, they were protective, like parents trying to save their children from danger by bringing them home. But I thought about Elena, about the other researchers who'd been transformed without choosing it, about the people who would come to this valley in the future. This couldn't be the only solution. I grabbed the seismic transmitter and began sending a new message. Teach. U.S. How to coexist. The response came immediately, vibrating up through the bedrock with such force that dust fell from the ceiling. But this time, the message wasn't just words. It was images, feelings, understanding, transmitted directly into my mind. I saw what they wanted. Not the complete evacuation of the valley, but respect. Recognition that this was a living place, not just a research site. Protocols that would protect the thermal systems from damage. Limits on human activity in the most sensitive areas. In return, they would share their knowledge. Insights into volcanic prediction that could save thousands of lives. Understanding of geothermal processes that could revolutionize clean energy. Partnership instead of invasion. The heat in the station began to subside. Elena struggled to her feet, her face flushed but no longer showing signs of heat exhaustion. Outside, the transformed figures were backing away, their glowing eyes dimmed to a more gentle radiance. One of them, the one who had been Dr. Martinez, approached the window one final time. When he spoke, his voice came through the seismic equipment, transmitted through the stone itself. "The offer stands," he said, "for those who choose it. But choice is the key word now." I looked at Elena. "Can you live with this? Knowing what's really down there?" She stared out at the thermal fields, where the transformed researchers were disappearing back into the steam and ash. "Can I go back to thinking this is just a geological site, after what we've seen?" The answer was no, for both of us. The valley had shown us its true nature, and there was no unknowing what we now knew. We would have to find a way to be its guardians, not its conquerors. The official report I filed 3 weeks later was a masterpiece of creative truth-telling. Increased thermal activity had forced a temporary evacuation of research personnel. New protocols were being developed for working in geologically sensitive areas. Several researchers had requested transfers to other projects after experiencing equipment failures and heat-related stress. None of it was technically a lie. Elena stayed, as I'd known she would. Her research took on a different focus after our encounter. Less about measuring and predicting volcanic activity, more about understanding the complex ecosystem interactions in thermal environments. She never directly mentioned the Tundra in her published papers, but her work began to revolutionize how geologists thought about active volcanic systems. Dr. Martinez and the others never returned to their human forms, but they didn't completely disappear either. Sometimes, when I was alone in the valley, I would see figures in the distance, watching from the thermal vents. And occasionally, when particularly dangerous conditions developed, unstable ground, or toxic gas buildups, equipment would mysteriously appear to warn visitors away from danger. The partnership wasn't perfect, but it was real. I established new guidelines for research in the valley. Smaller teams, limited access to the most thermally active areas, and mandatory briefings about respecting the geological sensitivity of the environment. I never mentioned spirits or transformed humans, but I made sure everyone understood that this place demanded a different kind of respect than ordinary wilderness. Most researchers accepted the restrictions without question. A few complained about the limitations on their work, but the ones who truly listened, who approached the valley with genuine reverence for its ancient power, sometimes reported unusual experiences. Impossible temperature readings that led to new discoveries. Equipment that seemed to repair itself overnight. Dreams of walking through the ash fields and feeling the heartbeat of the earth beneath their feet. Elena called them recruitment attempts. I thought of them as invitations. The Tunghak were still offering choice to those who could handle the truth. 6 months after our encounter, I received a visit from Dr. James Worthington, a volcanologist from Johns Hopkins, who'd heard about the anomalous thermal events in Katmai. He was young, ambitious, and convinced that science could explain everything if you just applied enough measurement and analysis. "Ranger Nakamura," he said, spreading his instruments across my office desk. "I've developed new seismic monitoring equipment that can map underground thermal systems with unprecedented accuracy. I'd like permission to conduct extensive surveys throughout the valley." I looked at his sophisticated equipment, then at the man himself. He had the attitude I'd seen in dozens of researchers over the years, the assumption that nature was just a puzzle waiting to be solved by the right technology. "Dr. Worthington," I said, carefully, "before I approve any research permits, I need to ask you something. How do you feel about the possibility that your equipment might detect things that can't be easily explained by current scientific models?" He laughed. "Ranger, if my equipment detects something that can't be explained, that just means we need better theories. There's no phenomenon in nature that can't eventually be understood through proper scientific method." I thought about Dr. Martinez, walking through superheated ash with skin made of cooled lava. I thought about Elena's thermal readings that showed impossible heat signatures moving with purpose and intelligence. I thought about the voices that spoke through stone and the ancient consciousness that had been protecting this valley since before humans existed. "I'm sorry, Dr. Worthington, but I can't approve your research proposal." "On what grounds?" I stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. In the distance, steam rose from hundreds of thermal vents, creating patterns that looked random unless you knew how to read them. On the grounds that some things are more important than scientific understanding. Some places require humility instead of analysis. He left angry, threatening to appeal my decision to higher authorities, but his complaints never gained traction. Elena's published research had begun to influence thinking in the geological community, and there were others now who supported the idea that thermal systems required more careful, respectful study. The Tunghak had found their champions among the scientists themselves. I retired from the Park Service last month, but I still live in the cabin I built at the edge of the valley. Sometimes, on clear nights, I walk out to the thermal fields and sit on the rocks where my grandmother used to tell me stories about fire spirits. The stories were true, but incomplete. The Tunghak aren't spirits in the way my grandmother's generation understood them. There's something more complex, consciousness that evolved in conditions no human brain could imagine. Intelligence that thinks in geological time, wisdom that sees the connections between all living systems. They're still here. Still protecting their home, still offering partnership to those who approach with respect instead of conquest. And sometimes, when the aurora borealis dances above the valley and the thermal vents pulse with their ancient rhythms, I can hear them calling to me, offering me the same choice they offered Elena and Martinez and all the others. Join us, see what we see, become part of something larger than individual human consciousness. I haven't accepted yet, but every night, the offer sounds a little more tempting. After all, the fire doesn't hurt once you understand what it really is. It's just another form of life, reaching out to touch life in return. Asterisk. Raymond Nakamura lives in a cabin at the edge of Katmai National Park, where he serves as an unofficial liaison between the scientific community and the valley's more unusual residents. His grandmother would have been proud. My name is Victor Kowalski, and I've been a park ranger at Denali for 17 years. In all that time, I thought I'd seen everything the Alaskan wilderness could throw at me. Bears, wolves, tourists who thought flip-flops were proper hiking gear, and storms that could freeze a man solid in minutes. But I was wrong, dead wrong. It was March 15th, 1971. When the call came in, the temperature outside my cabin was sitting at 30 below, and the aurora was putting on quite a show, green ribbons dancing across the star-packed sky like nature's own light display. I was sipping coffee and updating my logbook when the radio crackled to life. "Base to Kowalski. We've got a problem." I set down my mug and picked up the handset. "This is Kowalski. Go ahead." We lost contact with the research team at Wonder Lake. Dr. Sarah Chen's group. They were studying caribou migration patterns. My stomach dropped. Wonder Lake was 40 miles from the nearest road, deep in the backcountry, where the tundra stretched endlessly in every direction. How long since last contact? 18 hours. Their last transmission mentioned something about tracks that didn't make sense. Then nothing. I grabbed my gear and started packing. 3 researchers missing in weather like this meant I had maybe 24 hours before hypothermia turned a rescue mission into body recovery. I'd done enough of those to know the difference. I'm heading out at first light. I radioed back. Negative. You leave now. Storm's coming in tomorrow. That'll ground helicopters for a week. So much for sleep. I loaded my snowmobile with emergency supplies, survival gear, and enough coffee to keep me awake for the next 2 days. As I suited up in my cold weather gear, I tried not to think about what tracks that didn't make sense could mean. Probably just wolf prints in weird snow conditions. That's what I told myself. Anyway, the ride to Wonder Lake took 3 hours through terrain that looked like the surface of another planet. White tundra rolled away in every direction, broken only by the dark smudges of scattered spruce groves. The only sound was the growl of my snowmobile engine and the whistle of wind across the snow. I'd grown up hearing the old Inuit stories about the Tornarsuk spirit bears that hunted like wolves and were smart as men. My grandmother used to tell those tales to scare us kids into behaving. "The ice bears will get you if you wander too far from camp," she'd say. I never believed any of it. After 17 years of tracking real bears, I knew they were just animals. Big, dangerous animals, sure, but still just animals. I should have listened to my grandmother. When I reached the research team's last known position, I found their main camp still standing, but completely empty. 3 tents, a cooking station, and scientific equipment scattered around like the researchers had just stepped away for a minute. But the snow around the camp told a different story. Boot prints led away from the tents in 3 different directions. Each trail showed signs of running deep heel strikes, long strides, the kind of tracks people make when they're scared. But mixed in with the human prints were something else. Bear tracks. Massive ones. I knelt down to examine them closer and felt my first chill that had nothing to do with the cold. These weren't normal bear prints. They were huge, bigger than any grizzly I'd ever tracked, and they were arranged in a pattern that made my skin crawl. Bears don't hunt in formation, they don't coordinate attacks. But these tracks showed exactly that kind of behavior. 5 sets of bear prints, moving in a perfect circle around the camp, like they'd surrounded it. I followed the clearest trail of human prints, hoping to find Dr. Chen's team taking shelter somewhere nearby. Instead, I found their snowmobiles half a mile from camp, abandoned and torn apart. The seats were shredded, exposing yellow foam stuffing to the bitter air. Long claw marks scored the metal frames, cut so deep they went through steel. My radio crackled. "Kowalski, this is base. Status report." I keyed the handset with numb fingers. Found the camp, empty, following tracks now. "Any sign of the team?" I stared at the destroyed snowmobiles, then at the bear tracks that led away into the endless white. Still looking. What I didn't tell them was that some of those bear tracks looked wrong in ways I couldn't explain. The front paws showed what almost looked like thumbs, and the spacing between the prints suggested the creatures had been walking upright for parts of their journey. Bears don't walk upright. Not for long distances. Not in organized groups. But as I followed those impossible tracks deeper into the wilderness, I started to wonder what I really knew about bears, after all. The trail led me across a frozen creek and up onto a ridge where the wind had scoured the snow down to bare ice. Here, the tracks became even stranger. Mixed in with the bear prints were tool marks, scratches in the ice that looked deliberately made, like someone had been using the claws as cutting implements. I stopped my snowmobile and pulled out my camera, snapping photos of the clearest prints. Through the viewfinder, I could see details that made my hands shake. The bear tracks showed wear patterns on the claws that suggested regular use as tools, and in several prints, the spacing of the toes looked almost human-like. My radio squawked again. "Kowalski, we're sending backup. Mike Thompson will be flying out in the morning." "Roger that." I was grateful for the company. Mike was a good ranger, 15 years on the job and steady as a rock. If anyone could help me make sense of this, it was him. I followed the trail as it wound through a maze of ice hummocks and snowdrifts. The landscape here felt different somehow, too quiet, too empty. Usually, you'd see ravens or hear the distant howl of wolves. But here, there was nothing. Just the whistle of wind and the crunch of snow under my boots. That's when I found the first body. Dr. Sarah Chen lay in a hollow between two ice mounds, her bright red parka standing out against the white like a splash of blood. I approached carefully, checking for signs of life, even though I could tell from 20 feet away that it was too late. She'd been dead for hours. Her body was positioned in a way that didn't look natural. Arms folded across her chest, legs straight, like someone had arranged her deliberately. Around the body, the snow was packed down in perfect circles, as if something had been walking around and around her. I knelt beside her to check for obvious cause of death, trying to stay clinical and professional. No visible wounds, no signs of a bear attack. Her clothing wasn't torn. She looked almost peaceful, except for her eyes. Her eyes were wide open, staring up at the gray sky with an expression of absolute terror. I was reaching for my radio when I heard it, a sound that made every hair on my neck stand up. It was a growl, deep and rumbling, but it was coming from the wrong direction. Bears don't hide behind you when they're hunting. They charge straight on, all fury and claws. I turned slowly, my hand moving to the bear spray on my belt. Nothing. Just empty tundra stretching to the horizon. But the feeling of being watched was so strong I could taste it, metallic and sharp on my tongue. That's when I saw them. 5 shapes moving across the ridgeline. Too far away to make out clearly, but definitely too big to be wolves. They moved with purpose, spread out in a line like hunters driving prey, and they were between me and my snowmobile. I tried to keep calm, remembering my training. Back away slowly, make yourself look big, avoid eye contact. But as I watched, one of the shapes rose up on its hind legs. It stood there for a long moment, clearly visible against the sky, before dropping back down to all fours. Bears will rear up to get a better look at something, sure, but not for that long, and not with that kind of intelligence in the gesture. It had been studying me, the way a person might study an interesting bug. I started backing toward a cluster of large rocks, keeping my eyes on the ridge. The shapes were moving again, flowing across the snow with a coordination that made my skin crawl. This wasn't pack behavior from animals acting on instinct. This was strategy. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. Kowalski, this is Thompson. I'm 15 minutes out. What's your position? I grabbed the handset, still watching the ridge. 1/4 mile north of the research camp. Mike, listen carefully. Don't land near me. I think we've got a situation here. What kind of situation? I watched one of the shapes detach from the group and start moving down the ridge toward me. Even at distance, I could tell it was huge. The kind that has big teeth and walks on 2 legs when it wants to. Static filled the channel for a moment. Then Mike's voice came back, tight with concern. Victor, are you telling me we've got bears behaving like people? I'm telling you to be careful where you set that bird down. The shape was closer now, close enough that I could see it wasn't just big, it was massive. 12 feet tall when it reared up, with white fur that seemed to shimmer in the flat Arctic light. And when it looked at me, I saw something in those dark eyes that shouldn't have been there. Intelligence, recognition, purpose. It wasn't just hunting me, it was thinking about me. I reached the rocks and climbed up onto the largest one, trying to get some height advantage. From here, I could see more of the creatures spread out across the tundra. They'd formed a rough circle around my position, cutting off every escape route except one, the direction that led deeper into the backcountry, away from help. They weren't just hunting me, they were hurting me. That's when I realized Dr. Chen hadn't died from cold or accident. She died from fear. Pure, absolute terror at seeing something that shouldn't exist. Something that rewrote everything she thought she knew about the natural world. And now it was my turn to face whatever had killed her. The helicopter found me 3 hours later, huddled behind the rocks with my rifle ready and my nerves shot to hell. Mike Thompson set the bird down on a flat stretch of tundra, and I ran for it like my life depended on it, which it probably did. What happened out there? Mike shouted over the rotor noise as we lifted off. I looked down at the landscape below us, scanning for any sign of the creatures. Nothing. They'd vanished like they'd never been there at all. Found Dr. Chen. She's dead. Bear attack? I don't know what attacked her. That was the truth. I had no words for what I'd seen. We flew back to base camp in silence, the vast wilderness rolling away beneath us like a white ocean. But as we approached the landing pad, Mike's voice came over the intercom, tight with tension. "Victor, look at Grid 7. I followed his gaze to the southeast, where another research station sat on a small rise. Smoke was rising from the buildings, not the steady stream of a heating stove, but the thick black smoke of something burning out of control. "Set us down," I said, fast. The station was a disaster. 2 buildings completely destroyed, scientific equipment scattered across the snow like thrown toys. And in the center of it all, tire tracks from the station's ATV led away into the wilderness. Mike and I followed the tracks on foot, weapons ready. The trail was easy to read. Someone had left in a hurry, driving fast enough to spray snow behind them. But after half a mile, the ATV tracks stopped abruptly at the edge of a small valley. The vehicle sat at the bottom of the slope, overturned and partially buried in a snowdrift. And surrounding it were those same impossible tracks I'd seen at Dr. Chen's camp. Massive bear prints, but arranged in patterns that spoke of intelligence and planning. "Jesus Christ," Mike whispered, staring at the scene. "What are we dealing with here?" Before I could answer, we heard it. A sound that raised every hair on my arms, a deep, rumbling call that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't quite a roar, wasn't quite a howl. It was something in between, something that spoke of intelligence and hunger in equal measure. Mike grabbed his radio. "Base, this is Thompson. We need immediate backup at Research Station 7. And contact State Police. We've got multiple fatalities and something hunting in Sector 12. Static answered him. He tried again, adjusting frequencies. Nothing. "Radio's dead," he said, his face pale in the Arctic light. I pulled out my own handset and got the same result. Complete silence across all channels. They're jamming us somehow. "Bears don't jam radios, Victor. I know what bears don't do," I snapped. "But I also know what I saw out there. And it wasn't any kind of bear in any textbook." We searched the overturned ATV and found a journal belonging to Dr. Richards, the station leader. The final entry, dated yesterday, made my blood run cold. Asterisk. Day 12. "The bears are showing unprecedented behavioral patterns. They work together like wolves, but with problem-solving abilities I've never seen in the wild. Today I observed them using tools, actual tools, to break into our supply cache. When they noticed me watching, they didn't flee, they studied me back. I think they're learning our routines. Asterisk, asterisk. Day 13. They're not just bears. God help me, I don't know what they are. Asterisk. The rest of the page was covered in what looked like claw marks. Mike read over my shoulder, his breathing coming fast and shallow. "This is insane. Bears don't use tools. They don't plan attacks. These do." I closed the journal and scanned the ridgelines around us. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than before. "We need to get out of here, now." But as we turned to head back to the helicopter, we saw them. 6 massive white shapes standing on the ridge above our bird. Even at distance, their size was staggering. And they weren't just standing there randomly, they'd positioned themselves to block our escape route. "How did they know?" Mike whispered. I watched one of the creatures rear up on its hind legs and make a gesture with its front paws. A signal. The others immediately spread out along the ridge in response. "Because they're not animals," I said. "Not anymore." The largest of the creatures, the alpha, I guess threw back its massive head and let out that otherworldly call again. This time, it was answered. From all around the valley, more voices joined in, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with their hunting song. We were surrounded, cut off from our helicopter, our radios dead, with creatures that thought like people but had the strength to tear through steel. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I remembered my grandmother's stories about the Tornarsuk, asterisk. "They're not just bears, asterisk," she used to say. Asterisk. "They're what bears become when they learn to hunt like men." Asterisk. I'd always thought those were just stories. Now, watching the creatures coordinate their movements with military precision, I realized my grandmother had been trying to warn me. And I hadn't listened. We ran. There was nowhere else to go but deeper into the valley, away from the creatures on the ridge. Mike and I stumbled through knee-deep snow, our breath coming in sharp puffs of vapor. Behind us, I could hear them moving, the soft thud of massive paws hitting snow, getting closer with every second. "There," Mike pointed ahead to what looked like a dark opening in the valley wall. A cave. We dove inside just as something huge crashed through the bushes behind us. The cave was deeper than I'd expected, the entrance opening into a tunnel that sloped downward into darkness. We had flashlights, but I hesitated to use them. Light would give away our position. "Victor," Mike whispered, "look at the walls." I flicked on my light for just a second and immediately wished I hadn't. The cave walls were covered in scratches, claw marks that formed patterns. Not random scratches from animals sharpening their claws, but deliberate markings. Symbols. Pictures. The images showed bears standing upright like people, using tools, working together to hunt human figures. And in the deepest part of the cave, the pictures changed. They showed something that made my stomach turn, people becoming bears, their bodies changing, growing larger and more powerful. "This isn't possible," Mike breathed. A sound from the cave entrance cut him off the scrape of claws on stone. They'd found us. We went deeper into the tunnel, following it as it wound down into the earth. The air grew warmer, and I started to smell something that didn't belong in a cave: wood smoke and cooking meat. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber, lit by fires burning in carved stone bowls. And what I saw there broke something fundamental in my mind. It was a city. A crude, primitive city, but a city nonetheless. Stone shelters lined the walls, connected by pathways worn smooth by countless feet. Tools hung from carved hooks, spears, knives, even what looked like simple machines for processing meat and hides. And everywhere, moving through this impossible place, were the creatures. But they weren't just creatures anymore. Some walked on two legs like people, using their hands to manipulate tools. Others were still bear-like but moved with human intelligence, their dark eyes showing awareness and purpose. And a few looked almost human, except for their size and the white fur that covered their bodies. "What are they?" Mike whispered. An answer came from behind us, spoken in a voice that was almost human but twisted by vocal cords never meant for speech. "We are what you will become." The Alpha stood at the tunnel entrance, 12 feet of muscle and fur and terrible intelligence. When it spoke, the words came slowly, carefully, as if it were remembering how to use human language. "We were like you once," it continued, stepping into the chamber. "Small, weak, afraid of the cold and the dark, but we learned to change, to become something better." Mike raised his rifle, but the Alpha just laughed, a sound like grinding ice. "Your weapons cannot stop the transformation that has already begun." That's when I noticed the smell in the air wasn't just wood smoke. It was something else, something sweet and cloying that made my head spin. And my skin was starting to itch, like something was crawling under it. "The change begins with exposure," the Alpha explained, watching my discomfort with those intelligent, dark eyes. "First the scent, carried on the breath of the pack. Then the dreams. Then the hunger for meat and cold and the feeling of snow beneath your feet." I looked at Mike and saw the same horror in his eyes that I felt. The itching was getting worse, and I could swear my fingernails were growing longer. "Why?" I managed to ask. "Because the world above is ending," the Alpha said simply. "The ice will come again, as it always does, and when it comes, only those who have embraced the change will survive. We offer you that gift." Around us, the hybrid creatures watched silently. I could see the intelligence in their eyes, the awareness. These had been people once. Researchers, maybe. Hunters. Park rangers like me. "You're insane," Mike said, but his voice was shaking. "We are evolved." The Alpha gestured to the city around. "We have built something that will last through the next ice age. A civilization adapted to the cold, to the hunt, to survival itself. Join us willingly, and you will retain more of what you were. Fight us." It didn't need to finish the threat. But I wasn't going down without a fight. I still had one thermite flare left from my emergency gear, the kind we used for emergency signals. If I could create enough light and noise. I pulled the pin and threw it as hard as I could into the center of the chamber. The flare exploded in a burst of brilliant white light and deafening noise. The creatures shrieked and scattered, their sensitive eyes and ears overwhelmed. In the confusion, Mike and I ran. We made it back to the tunnel, then up and out into the blessed cold of the surface world. Behind us, I could hear them recovering, starting to follow. But we had a head start. The helicopter, Mike gasped. If we can get to the helicopter. But when we reached the 12th ridge, the bird was gone. Not destroyed, gone. Lifted away by something with the strength to carry a 2-ton aircraft. We were trapped in the wilderness with things that had once been human, things that wanted to make us like them. And somewhere deep in my bones, I could feel the change beginning. The itching was spreading. We survived. I'm not sure how, but we did. 3 days of running through the backcountry, dodging the pack, living on emergency rations and melted snow. My fingernails grew longer and harder. Mike developed a craving for raw meat, but somehow we made it to the park road where a search and rescue team found us. The official report said we were victims of a coordinated bear attack. Equipment failure explained our missing helicopter. Exposure and trauma explained our confused accounts of what we'd seen in the wilderness. They gave us medical leave for psychological recovery, but the changes didn't stop. I transferred to a park in Arizona. 6 months later, as far from the Arctic as I could get. The warm weather helped slow whatever was happening to me, but it couldn't stop it completely. I sleep better during the day now. Raw meat tastes better than cooked. And sometimes, late at night, I hear voices calling to me from somewhere far to the north. Mike didn't make the transfer. They found him last winter in the woods outside Fairbanks, living wild. When they tried to bring him in, he ran. They say he moves like an animal now, and his eyes reflect light like a nocturnal predator's. I still fight it. Take vitamin D supplements to counter the craving for darkness. Force myself to eat cooked food. Avoid cold places and the smell of snow, but I know it's just delaying the inevitable. The worst part isn't the physical changes, it's the dreams. Every night, I dream of the chamber beneath the tundra, of the hybrid city growing larger and more sophisticated. They're spreading, you see, moving south as the climate changes, following the cold fronts and winter storms. And in my dreams, they're still calling to me, "Come home, Victor, come home to the pack." Sometimes I wake up to find myself standing at the window, looking north toward Alaska. My skin itches, and my fingernails have grown again despite my efforts to keep them short. In those moments, I understand what the alpha meant about the Ice Age returning. It's not a geological event, it's evolution. If you're reading this, stay away from the remote places where the aurora dances bright. Don't follow strange tracks in the snow, no matter how curious you get. And if you ever hear that hunting call echoing across the wilderness, that sound that's not quite roar, not quite howl, run. Run south, toward the warmth and the light, because the Tornarsuk are real, and they're still out there, and they're always looking for new pack members. My name is Elena Fitzpatrick, and I've been a park ranger at Glacier Bay for 12 years. People think my job is all about giving tours and checking camping permits, but here in Alaska, we deal with real problems: missing hikers, bear attacks, boats that break down in waters so cold they'll kill you in minutes. I never thought I'd be dealing with something like this. It started on a Tuesday morning in June. The sun was already high up here. June means daylight all day and all night. I was drinking coffee in my office when the Coast Guard called. "Elena, we need you to check something out," said Captain Torres. His voice sounded tight. Fishing boat called Northern Star found her drifting empty in Muir Inlet. Empty boats aren't unusual. Engines fail, people fall overboard, storms hit fast. But something in Torres's voice made my stomach clench. "Any sign of the crew?" I asked. "That's the weird part. 5 guys went out yesterday morning. Boat looks perfect. No damage, no distress calls, plenty of fuel. But they're gone." I grabbed my gear and headed for the dock. My boat, the Ranger 3, cut through the calm water toward Muir Inlet. The mountains rose around me like walls, their peaks still covered in snow even in summer. Below the water, I knew there were deep channels carved by glaciers thousands of years ago. Some places, the bottom drops down over 1,000 feet. The Northern Star was drifting near the mouth of the inlet. From a distance, she looked fine. A good-sized fishing boat, maybe 40 feet long, with her nets still hanging off the stern. I pulled alongside and climbed aboard. The deck was clean, too clean. Usually fishing boats are covered in scales, blood, and gear. This one looked like someone had scrubbed it down. The wheelhouse was empty, but the radio was still on. Coffee in the captain's mug was cold but not moldy. Whatever happened, it was recent. I checked the logbook. The last entry was from yesterday, at 2 p.m. Good catch in deep water. Heading to new spot, Sarah mentioned. That's when I noticed the fish hold. I've been around fishing boats my whole life. I know what salmon look like, what halibut look like, what cod look like. The fish in this hold weren't any of those. They were huge, for one thing. Some were 4 feet long, with big eyes and teeth like needles. Their skin was pale, almost white. I'd never seen anything like them, and I had a marine biology degree before I became a ranger. The weird thing was, they looked like deep-sea fish, the kind that live thousands of feet down in the ocean. But we were in a fjord. The water here was deep, but not that deep. I called Torres on the radio. "Captain, you need to see this." "What'd you find?" "I don't know what I found. That's the problem." While I waited for the Coast Guard boat, I looked around more. In the captain's cabin, I found something that made my skin crawl. Sarah Chen's business card was taped to the wall. Sarah was a marine biologist from the university. We'd worked together before. But Sarah was supposed to be in Seattle for a conference. I called her number. It went straight to voicemail. The Coast Guard arrived an hour later. Torres took one look at the fish and called his boss. His boss called the state police. The state police called some guy from Fish and Game who said he'd never seen anything like it. Could be a new species. The Fish and Game guy said, "Global warming is pushing deep-sea fish into new areas." That sounded reasonable, but it didn't explain where 5 experienced fishermen had gone. We towed the Northern Star back to Bartlett Cove. By evening, I was sitting in my cabin, staring at the photos I'd taken of those fish. Their eyes looked almost human. I tried calling Sarah again. Still, voicemail. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the Tlingit stories my grandmother used to tell. She was half Tlingit, and she knew all the old legends. She used to talk about things that lived in the deepest parts of the water, things that were older than humans. The Gunalshesh, she called them, water spirits that lived in the roots of the glaciers. I'd always thought they were just stories. The next morning, I got a call that made everything worse. "Elena, this is Dr. Chen's research assistant, Mike. Is she up there with you?" My heart started beating faster. "No, Mike. I've been trying to reach her. Isn't she at the conference in Seattle?" That's what we thought. But she never showed up. Her hotel says she never checked in. Her last credit card charge was for a seaplane ticket to Juneau. I hung up and stared at the business card I'd found on the fishing boat. Why had Sarah come up here without telling anyone? I spent the morning asking around. The harbor master at Bartlett Cove remembered her. "Yeah, pretty Asian lady, right? She chartered a boat Monday afternoon, wanted to go to Muir Inlet. Said she was studying deep-sea migration patterns." Monday, the day before the Northern Star went missing. Who took her out? Local guy named Pete Morrison. But he's been acting weird since he got back. Won't talk to anyone. I found Pete at the Alaskan bar in Gustavus, drinking whiskey at 10 in the morning. His hands were shaking. "Pete, I'm Elena Fitzpatrick, Park Service. I heard you took Dr. Chen out on Monday." He looked at me with bloodshot eyes. "I ain't talking about that. Pete, she's missing. Her family is worried." He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Missing? Lady, she ain't missing. She's down there with them." "Down where? With who?" Pete finished his drink and ordered another. "You ever been diving in Muir Inlet, Elena?" "A few times." "Why?" "How deep you gone?" "Maybe 200 feet. That's about the limit for normal diving gear. I taken people deeper. Scientists, mostly. They pay good money to see the bottom of them channels." His hands kept shaking. Monday, that Dr. Chen wanted to go down to 600 feet. Had her own diving gear, real fancy stuff. 600 feet was serious deep-sea diving, dangerous even for experts. "What happened down there?" Pete's face went white. "She found something. Or something found her." "What do you mean?" "I was watching on the surface, tracking her air bubbles. Everything normal for about 20 minutes. Then the water started getting weird." "Weird how?" "Temperature changed, got real cold, real fast. And there were lights down there, not from her equipment. These were different. Moving around like they were alive. I felt goosebumps on my arms. What else?" Her voice started coming through the radio, real excited. Said she found buildings down there, old buildings, covered in carvings. Then she started screaming. Screaming about what? Pete stared into his drink. Said something was watching her. Something big and smart. Did you pull her up? I tried. But the line went dead. No more radio, no more bubbles. I waited 2 hours, then called the Coast Guard. He looked at me with scared eyes. They never found her body. I bought Pete another drink and left him alone. Outside, the day felt colder than it should have. That afternoon, I got permission to take a diving team to Muir Inlet. If Sarah had found something down there, I needed to see it for myself. We went out in the Coast Guard cutter with 2 experienced divers and a remotely operated vehicle. The ROV could go deeper than any human diver. The water in Muir Inlet was calm and clear. We dropped the ROV at the exact spot Pete had marked on his GPS. At 300 feet, we started seeing fish. The same weird, pale fish from the Northern Star. At 500 feet, the ROV's lights picked up something that shouldn't have been there. Stone walls. They were covered in carvings, spirals and tentacles and shapes that hurt to look at. The stone was black and old. Really old. How old you think this is? Asked Jimmy, one of the divers. I stared at the monitor. I don't know. But people didn't build this. We guided the ROV along the wall. The carvings got more detailed as we went deeper. They showed creatures with tentacles and human faces. Creatures that looked like they were teaching humans things. At 600 feet, we found Sarah's diving gear. It was scattered across the seafloor like someone had torn it off in a hurry. Her wetsuit was shredded, but not by rocks or fish. The tears were too clean, too precise. Jesus, whispered Jimmy. What could do that? Before I could answer, the ROV's lights picked up movement in the distance. Something big was swimming toward us. Pull it up, I said. Pull it up now. But as the ROV rose, I saw something that made my blood freeze. In the last few seconds before we lost visual, the lights showed a face in the darkness below us. Sarah's face. But she was breathing underwater. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Sarah's face, looking up at us from 600 feet underwater. It was impossible. Humans can't breathe water. Humans can't survive the pressure. But I'd seen it. The next morning, 3 more boats went missing, all fishing boats, all from the same area of Muir Inlet. The Coast Guard found them, drifting empty, just like the Northern Star. No crews, no distress calls, no signs of struggle. But each boat had the same strange fish in their holds. Captain Torres called an emergency meeting. The harbor was buzzing with scared fishermen and worried families. We're closing Muir Inlet to all boat traffic, Torres announced. Something down there is dangerous. Old Frank Morrison, Pete's uncle, stood up. Frank had been fishing these waters for 50 years. My grandfather used to say this would happen, Frank said, when the ice started melting too fast. When the water got too warm, they'd wake up. Who'd wake up? Asked Torres. The Gunal Sheish, the old ones who sleep in the deepest places. Most people laughed, but I didn't. I was thinking about those stone carvings, older than any human civilization. After the meeting, Frank pulled me aside. You're Elena Fitzpatrick, right? Mary Fitzpatrick's granddaughter? I nodded. You knew my grandmother? She was wise. Knew the old stories. Your grandmother always said the Fitzpatricks had the sight, said you'd be important someday. Important how? Frank's eyes were serious. They're choosing people, Elena, taking them for a reason. Your Dr. Chen wasn't the first. There've been others over the years. Scientists, mostly. People who understand the water. What do they want? Same thing any dying race wants. A future. That afternoon, I made a decision that probably saved my life. I called in sick and drove to my grandmother's old cabin. She'd died 5 years ago, but I'd kept all her books and papers. If there were answers, they'd be there. I found them in a leather journal she'd hidden in the basement. Pages and pages of Tlingit legends written in her careful handwriting. The Gunalkesh weren't just spirits, they were real. An ancient race of sea creatures who'd lived in the deepest parts of the ocean for millions of years. When the glaciers formed, they'd moved into the underwater canyons, sleeping in the cold darkness. But climate change was warming the water, melting their ice caves, destroying their world, so they were adapting, learning, taking humans to study them. My grandmother's journal had drawings, creatures with tentacles and human-like intelligence. Creatures who could change their shape, breathe air or water, survive in any environment. The last entry was from just before she died. They're waking up. The signs are starting. When they do, they'll need teachers. Humans who can help them understand our world. The Fitzpatricks have always been between the two worlds. Elena will have to choose. I was still reading when my phone rang. Elena, you need to get down here right now, Torres said. We found something. I raced back to the harbor. A crowd was gathered around the dock, staring at something in the water. It was Sarah. She was floating on her back, but she was breathing. Her skin was pale and her eyes were black, but she was alive. Don't touch her, I said, as some fishermen reached for her. Sarah's head turned toward my voice. When she spoke, her voice sounded wrong, like she was speaking through water. Elena Fitzpatrick, she said, they want to meet you. Who wants to meet me? The teachers, the old ones. They've been waiting for someone who understands both worlds. Sarah's body began to change as I watched. Her skin became smoother. Her fingers grew longer. Gills opened on the sides of her neck. They're offering you a choice, she said. Learn from them and help them learn from us, or watch your world die as theirs is dying. Before anyone could stop her, Sarah slipped back under the water and disappeared. The crowd started panicking. People were calling her a monster, a demon. Some wanted to get guns and hunt her down. But I understood what my grandmother had known. The Gunalshesh weren't evil. They were desperate. And somehow, they thought I could help them. That night, more people vanished. A marine biologist from Anchorage, 2 graduate students from the University of Alaska, a fisherman who'd spent his whole life studying the water. All of them scientists. All of them people who understood the ocean. The military arrived the next day. They set up a perimeter around Muir Inlet and started talking about depth charges. I knew that would be a disaster. If we attacked them, they'd fight back. And we had no idea how powerful they really were. I had to do something. I stole a diving suit from the Coast Guard station that night. I know, it sounds crazy, but everything my grandmother had taught me, everything I'd learned about these waters, told me there was only one way to stop this. I had to go down and talk to them myself. The water was black and cold as I descended. At 200 feet, I started seeing the lights Pete had described. Not electric lights, something organic, like the creatures themselves, were glowing. At 400 feet, they came for me. I saw them rising from the depths like living nightmares, 20, 30 feet long, with tentacles that moved like intelligent snakes. Their eyes were huge and dark and filled with an alien intelligence. But they didn't attack me. Instead, they surrounded me and guided me deeper. Down past the stone walls, past the carvings, into caverns I never knew existed. The pressure should have killed me. But somehow, I could breathe. The water felt warm, comfortable. Like they were protecting me. They brought me to a vast underwater city. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time. Spires of coral and stone reaching up through the water. Buildings that seemed to grow instead of being built. And everywhere, the creatures moved like living thoughts. In the center of the city, I found the missing people. They weren't dead. They weren't exactly human anymore either. Sarah was there, but changed. Her skin was smooth and pale, her eyes huge and dark. She could breathe water now, but she could still think like a human. Elena, she said, her voice carrying perfectly through the water. You came. What did they do to you? Gave me a gift. Let me see what they see. Understand what they understand. She showed me images that appeared directly in my mind. The Earth's oceans rising as the ice caps melted. Whole cities underwater. Millions of people dying as their world changed. But also hope. The Gunalshesh had survived changes before. They knew how to adapt, how to live in both worlds. They want to teach us, Sarah said, help us become something that can survive what's coming, by turning us into them, by making us better, stronger, able to breathe air or water, live on land or sea. The largest of the creatures approached me then, Its tentacles were gentle as they touched my arms, my face. Images flooded my mind. I saw their history, millions of years of life in the deep ocean. Watching as primitive humans first built boats, first learned to fish, staying hidden, studying us, waiting for us to become wise enough to understand. But human civilization was destroying the oceans, warming them, polluting them, killing everything that lived there. The Gunalshaish were dying, and so were we. They were offering a partnership, their knowledge of the sea, our knowledge of the land. Together, we could survive what was coming. But it meant changing, becoming something new. The creature's thoughts pressed into my mind, showing me the choice. I could go back to the surface and live my normal life while both our species slowly died. Or I could stay, let them change me, and help build a future for both our peoples. I thought about my grandmother's words. The Fitzpatricks had always been between two worlds, but I also thought about the people on the surface. My friends, my life, everything I'd ever known. I need time to decide, I said. The creature's thoughts were sad but understanding. It gestured to Sarah. Take him back, it said without words. But remember, the waters are rising. The choice won't wait forever. Sarah guided me back to the surface. As we rose, I felt the change they'd given me fading. My lungs started burning as normal human limitations returned. At the surface, Coast Guard boats surrounded me with spotlights. They pulled me aboard, shouting questions I couldn't answer. The next morning, the military attacked the underwater city with depth charges. The water in Muir Inlet turned red. Not with blood, but with something else, something that glowed. Then the retaliation began. The tsunamis hit the coast 6 hours later. Not natural tsunamis. These were controlled, precise. They destroyed the military boats and washed away the equipment on shore, but left the fishing villages mostly untouched. A message. We could live together, or we could die apart. The attacks stopped as suddenly as they'd started. The weird fish disappeared from the fishing boats. The lights in the deep water went dark. But sometimes, on clear nights, I can see them moving down there, waiting. 3 months later, Sarah surfaced again. She looked completely human, but I could see the changes if I knew what to look for. The way she moved in the water, the way her eyes reflected light in the dark. They're giving humans time to understand, she told me, but the oceans are still rising, the climate is still changing. Eventually, we'll have to choose. What did you choose? She smiled. I chose to be a bridge, to help when the time comes. More people have gone missing since then, always scientists, always people who work with water. They come back changed, but still themselves. Still human, but more. I've kept my grandmother's journal. I've learned the old stories. And I've waited. Because I know what's coming. The water temperature keeps rising. The ice keeps melting. The seas keep getting higher. And down in the deepest parts of Glacier Bay, an ancient civilization is preparing for the day when the surface world will need their help to survive. My name is Elena Fitzpatrick. I'm still a park ranger, still protecting these waters, but now I know what I'm really protecting them from. Us. The choice is still waiting. It always will be, until we're wise enough to make it, or until the rising waters make it, for us. I keep my diving gear ready, just in case. Because someday, someone will have to go back down there and build that bridge between two worlds. And the Fitzpatricks have always been between two worlds. My name is David Thornton, and I've been a park ranger for 18 years. Most of that time has been here in Wrangell Street, Elias, the biggest national park in Alaska. People think being a ranger means sitting in a cabin and checking permits, but my job is different. I study ice. Glaciers, specifically. How they move, where they're safe to walk, and when they're about to kill you. The Malaspina Glacier is my beat. It's bigger than Rhode Island and older than human memory. Most visitors never see it because you can only reach it by bush plane, and even then, you need someone who knows the ice. That someone is me. I learned about ice in the Air Force, reading weather patterns and predicting storms. But glaciers are different. They're alive in ways that don't make sense until you've spent years watching them breathe and shift and crack open like giant mouths. I can read glacier ice the way some people read books. I know when it's solid and when it's about to drop you into a crevasse. So deep, your body will never be found. The local Ayak people have stories about this place. Old stories. They talk about the Yai, ice spirits who live in the deepest, oldest parts of the glacier. According to the legends, these spirits know everything that will happen. Past, present, future. It's all the same to them. They're supposed to be frozen prophets, trapped in ice since the world was young. I never put much stock in those stories. In my line of work, you stick to facts. Ice temperature, pressure readings, movement rates. The supernatural doesn't help you when you're standing on a glacier that could swallow you whole. But April 1981 changed everything I thought I knew about ice, about time, and about the things that can live forever in the cold. It started with a routine assessment. The spring breakup was beginning, which meant the ice was getting unstable. My job was to map the new crevasse formations and update the safety zones for the summer research teams. Simple work, if you know what you're doing. I flew in on a Tuesday morning with Pete Morrison, a bush pilot who'd been flying this route for 20 years. Pete knew the glacier almost as well as I did. We'd worked together dozens of times, and he'd never been nervous about a drop-off before. But that morning, something was different. "Ice looks wrong," Pete said as we circled for landing. His voice crackled through the headset, tight with concern. I looked down at the glacier below us. From the air, it looked normal. Dirty white, stretching to the horizon, broken by the dark lines of crevasses and the occasional rock outcrop. But Pete was right. Something felt wrong. "Temperature's been steady," I said, checking my instruments. No unusual melt patterns on the satellite images. Not talking about temperature. Pete brought us down toward the landing zone, a flat section of ice we'd used dozens of times before. "Look at the color." I pressed my face to the small poisse window and looked more carefully. The ice that should have been white or pale blue had a different tint to it, darker, almost gray, like old bone. "Probably just dirt from a rock slide," I said, but I didn't believe it myself. Pete set us down hard, the skis of the small plane scraping against ice that felt different under the landing. Not softer, exactly, just different. Like it had more weight to it. "Pickups in 3 days," Pete said as I gathered my gear. "Radio check every 6 hours, same as always. David." Pete's voice stopped me at the door. "If something feels off, call early. Don't wait for the scheduled pickup." I'd never heard Pete talk like that before. In 20 years of flying, he'd seen everything the Alaska wilderness could throw at him. Nothing spooked Pete Morrison. "Everything okay?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the glacier. "Ayak Elder came to see me last week. Old Margaret." She said the ice was dreaming. Dreaming? Her words, not mine. Said the Yai were stirring, talking in their sleep. Pete shook his head. "Probably nothing. But Margaret's people have lived here a long time. They don't make things up." I shouldered my pack and stepped out onto the ice. The sound was wrong immediately. My boots on glacier ice usually made a hard, sharp crack with each step. This ice absorbed the sound, muffling it like snow. 3 days, Pete called out. The plane lifted off, leaving me alone on the glacier. I'd been alone on ice hundreds of times before, but this felt different. The silence was too complete. No wind, no creaking of shifting ice, no distant rumble of calving, just perfect. Absolute quiet. I set up my base camp in the usual spot, a sheltered area between 2 pressure ridges that protected against wind. The work was routine: assemble the tent, set up the radio equipment, check my instruments. But every few minutes, I found myself looking over my shoulder. There was nothing to see. Just ice stretching in every direction, broken by the occasional dark crack or jutting rock. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. By evening, I'd completed the first section of my survey. The ice was stable enough, but the color was definitely wrong. Not just gray, but almost translucent in places, like you could see deep into it. I'd never seen glacier ice look like that before. I made my evening radio check and settled in for the night. The temperature dropped fast once the sun went down, but the tent held warm. I was reading over my notes when I heard the first sound. It was distant and low, like whale song, but different, slower, more deliberate. It seemed to come from deep in the ice, rising up through layers of frozen time. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. The night was clear, with enough starlight to see the glacier stretching away in all directions. The sound came again, longer this time. Definitely from below the ice. Glaciers make noise. They crack and groan and shift constantly. I knew all those sounds. This wasn't one of them. This sounded like singing. I didn't sleep well that first night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear that low, singing sound from deep in the ice. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it was just the glacier settling. Maybe water moving through channels I couldn't see. But then I found the hole. I was setting up my equipment for the day's survey when I noticed something that shouldn't have been there. About 50 yards from my camp, a perfect circular opening had appeared in the ice. Not a crevasse, those are jagged, violent things. This was smooth, like it had been carved with tools. The hole was maybe 3 feet across and so deep I couldn't see the bottom with my flashlight. The edges were smooth as glass, and the ice around it was that same strange gray color I'd noticed from the plane. I'd surveyed this exact area the day before. There had been no hole. I made careful notes and took photographs. In my 18 years as a ranger, I'd never seen anything like it. Holes don't just appear in glacier ice overnight. The ice here was hundreds of feet thick and solid as concrete. But there it was. I was leaning over the edge, trying to estimate the depth, when I heard the singing again. This time it was definitely coming from inside the hole. Clear and unmistakable. I pulled back and checked my radio. The morning check-in wasn't for another 2 hours, but I considered calling early. Pete's warning echoed in my head. Instead, I did what I always did when faced with something I didn't understand. I investigated. I tied a rope around my waist and anchored it to my ice axe. Then I lowered my flashlight into the hole on a cord. The beam disappeared into gray ice walls that seemed to go down forever. The singing got louder. It wasn't one voice. It was several, all harmonizing in tones I'd never heard before. Low and high at the same time, like they were coming from creatures with different kinds of throats than humans. I started to pull the flashlight back up, but the cord went slack. When I reeled it in, the light was gone. Not broken, just gone. The cord was cut clean, like something had sliced through it with a razor. I was backing away from the hole when I saw the first one. At the bottom of the hole, maybe 20 feet down, a face looked up at me, human-shaped but wrong in ways that made my brain refuse to process what I was seeing. The skin was blue-white, like old ice, and the eyes were completely black. But it was moving. Turning its head to look at me, the thing in the ice was alive. I ran back to my camp and grabbed the radio. Base, this is Thornton. Priority check-in. Static. Base, do you copy? This is Ranger Thornton requesting immediate pickup. More static than Pete's voice, distant and broken. .Thornton.copy. Weather, moving in .ca ent. 3 days. The transmission cut out completely. I tried the radio for an hour, but got nothing but static. Whatever was happening with the weather, I was stuck on the glacier until the scheduled pickup. I spent the rest of the morning documenting everything I could. The hole, the strange ice, the sounds. I took measurements and made sketches. Part of me hoped that approaching it like a scientific problem would make it less terrifying. It didn't work. By noon, there were more holes. 3 of them, arranged in a perfect triangle around my camp. Each one was identical, smooth, circular, impossibly deep. And from each one came that low singing sound. I moved my camp to higher ground, a pressure ridge that gave me a view of the glacier in all directions. That's when I saw how bad things really were. Holes were appearing everywhere, dozens of them, scattered across the ice like bullet wounds. And from each one, that singing rose into the thin air. The sound was getting louder, more complex, like a choir warming up for a performance. I was documenting the new holes through my binoculars when I saw movement. Not in the holes this time, but on the surface. A figure was walking across the ice toward my position. At first, I thought it was another person, maybe a researcher who'd gotten separated from their team. But as it got closer, I could see it wasn't human. It walked upright, but its limbs were too long and moved in ways that joints shouldn't bend. Its skin was that same blue-white color as the face in the hole, and it left no footprints on the ice. The thing stopped about 100 yards away and stood perfectly still. It was close enough now that I could see its face clearly through the binoculars. It looked like it had been carved from ice, high cheekbones, a sharp nose, and those completely black eyes. But the most disturbing thing was its expression. It looked sad, ancient and infinitely sad. We stared at each other across the glacier for what felt like hours. Then, without warning, it spoke. The voice carried easily across the ice, despite the distance. It spoke in a language I'd never heard before, but somehow I understood every word. The warm time comes too fast. The ice dreams of drowning. We must show you what will be. I lowered the binoculars, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. That's when I noticed the ice around my camp was changing. The gray color was spreading, and where it touched, the ice became transparent. I could see down through layers and layers of frozen time, like looking through glass. And in those depths, I could see them. Hundreds of figures preserved in the ice, all with that same ancient, sad expression. All looking up at me. The ice prophets, the Ayak people whispered about. They were real, and they were waking up. The singing grew louder as the day wore on. By evening, it was so loud I could feel it in my chest, like standing next to huge speakers. The holes were still appearing, faster now, and from some of them, I could see hands reaching up toward the surface, hands that glowed with cold blue light. I made another attempt with the radio as the sun set, but got nothing. The weather was clear and still. Whatever was blocking my signals wasn't natural. As darkness fell, the blue glow from the holes grew brighter. The glacier looked like a circuit board, lines of light connecting pools of brightness. And in that light, more figures began to emerge. They climbed out of the holes like they were climbing out of swimming pools. Dozens of them, all with that same impossible blue-white skin and black eyes. They stood on the glacier ice and looked toward my camp. Then they started walking. I spent the night on top of the pressure ridge with my back against a wall of ice, watching the blue figures move across the glacier below. They didn't walk like humans. Their movements were too fluid, like they were skating, even though their feet never left the ice. There were dozens of them now, maybe more. They moved in patterns that made no sense, circling my position in spirals that got tighter and tighter. But they never came closer than 100 yards. They were waiting for something. By morning, I'd counted at least 60 of the creatures. They stood motionless on the ice like an army of statues, all facing toward me. In the daylight, I could see them more clearly. They wore no clothes, but their skin looked thick and textured, like it was made of compressed snow. Some of them were tall and thin, others shorter and broader. A few looked almost human, while others had proportions that hurt to look at. But they all had those same black eyes, and they all looked infinitely sad. I tried the radio again and got the same result, static mixed with broken fragments of transmission. But this time, I heard something else in the static. Voices speaking, in that same unknown language the first creature had used. And underneath it all, that constant singing, the ice around my camp was now completely transparent. I could see down through it for what looked like miles, layer upon layer of frozen history, and in every layer there were more of them. Thousands of figures preserved in ice, all sleeping until now. I was studying the ice formations through my binoculars when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. At the edge of my vision, maybe 2 miles away, there was something moving that wasn't blue and glowing. It was yellow and red, human colors. I focused the binoculars and felt my stomach drop. It was a person in winter gear, walking across the ice toward the concentration of holes, moving directly toward the waiting creatures. "No," I whispered, then shouted as loud as I could. "Turn back, get away from there." My voice echoed across the glacier, but the figure kept walking. Too far away to hear me. Too far away for me to reach in time. I watched in horror as the person approached the nearest group of creatures. They didn't seem to see them. How could they not see them? The blue figures were standing right there, clear as day in the morning sun. The person walked right through them. That's when I realized the truth. The creatures weren't fully solid yet. They were somewhere between the ice and the real world, still mostly trapped in their frozen prison, but getting stronger. But the person could affect them. As they passed through the group of creatures, the blue figures flickered and became more solid. Like the human presence was feeding them energy, helping them manifest. The The singing got louder. I grabbed my pack and started down from the ridge. I had to warn whoever it was, had to get them away from this place before the creatures became solid enough to touch them. I'd made it maybe halfway when the person reached the edge of the largest hole. They stopped and knelt down like they were examining it. Through the binoculars, I could see them leaning over the edge, just like I had the day before. The creatures began to move toward them. "Run!" I screamed, waving my arms. "Get away from there!" The person looked up at the sound of my voice, and I could see their face clearly for the first time. It was a woman, maybe 30 years old, with short dark hair sticking out from under a knit hat. She looked confused, like she couldn't understand why I was yelling. She looked right at the approaching creatures and showed no sign of seeing them. That's when I understood. They were invisible to her. I could see them because I'd been here when they started waking up, because I'd heard their songs and looked into their black eyes. But to her, they didn't exist. The first creature reached her just as I started running down the ice. It passed a hand over her head, almost gentle, like a blessing. The woman shuddered and stood up, looking around with a confused expression. More creatures gathered around her. They touched her arms, her face, her chest. Each touch made them more solid and made her more pale. She started to sway on her feet. "Sarah?" she called out, her voice carrying across the ice. "Sarah, is that you?" There was no one else on the glacier, but she was looking at something I couldn't see. I was still 500 yards away when she smiled and started walking toward the hole. Not the careful, testing steps of someone on dangerous ice. She walked with confidence, like she was walking toward a friend. "Wait for me," she called out. "I'm coming." She reached the edge of the hole and didn't hesitate. She stepped off the edge and fell into the darkness. The singing stopped all at once. The sudden silence was so complete it made my ears ring. I stumbled to a halt, breathing hard in the thin air. The blue creatures were gone, vanished like they'd never been there. The holes were still, open, but the glow had faded. The ice was returning to its normal white color, but I could still feel them down there, waiting, growing stronger. I reached the hole where the woman had fallen and looked down. There was no sign of her, no body, no equipment, nothing. Just smooth ice walls disappearing into darkness. But carved into the ice near the bottom, in letters that glowed with faint blue light, were words in English. "The warm time kills the world. We show you true." I backed away from the hole and tried to process what I'd just witnessed. A person had died. Walked right into a trap I could see, but she couldn't. And somehow, her death had fed the creatures, made them stronger. That's when I heard the sound of an engine. I looked up and saw a small plane circling the glacier. Not Pete's plane, this one was red and white, with research equipment mounted on the wings. It was coming in for a landing. More people, more victims for the creatures to feed on. I ran toward the landing zone, waving my arms and shouting. But I knew they couldn't see the danger any more than the woman had. To them, this would just look like a normal glacier with some interesting ice formations. The plane touched down about a quarter-mile from my position. I could see two people inside as the engine shut down. They were gathering their equipment, getting ready to explore. The holes were already starting to glow again. I had to reach them before the creatures did. I had to make them understand that this place was death, even if I couldn't make them see what I could see. But as I ran across the ice toward the plane, I realized something that made my blood freeze worse than the Arctic air. If the creatures needed human contact to become solid, and if each person they touched made them stronger, what would happen when they'd fed on enough people? What would happen when they became solid enough to leave the glacier? The plane's doors opened, and two researchers stepped out onto the ice. They looked around with the excitement of scientists discovering something new and interesting. They had no idea they were standing on top of an army of sleeping monsters that had been waiting for thousands of years to wake up. And those monsters were getting hungrier. I reached the research plane just as the two scientists were unloading their equipment. A man and a woman, both young, both excited to be working on what they probably thought was a routine glacier study. "Get back in the plane," I shouted, still running toward them. "You have to leave, now." They looked up at me with surprise. The man stepped forward, holding up a hand in a peaceful gesture. "Are you okay?" he called out. "I'm Dr. James Chen from the University of Alaska. This is Dr. Lisa Park." Are you injured? I slowed as I reached them, breathing hard. You have to get out of here. This place isn't safe. What's wrong? Dr. Park asked. She was looking around at the glacier, probably seeing the same thing I'd seen when I first arrived, just ice and snow stretching to the horizon. Did you fall? Hit your head? Listen to me. I grabbed Dr. Chen's arm. There are things in the ice, ancient things. They're waking up, and they're dangerous. The two researchers exchanged glances. Dr. Chen's expression was patient but concerned, like he was dealing with someone who'd been alone too long. Sir, what's your name? Dr. Park asked gently. David Thornton. I'm a park ranger. I've been studying this glacier for 15 years, and I'm telling you we need to leave. Right now. Mr. Thornton, Dr. Chen said, we flew over your camp on the way in. We saw your radio equipment. Have you been able to contact anyone? The radios don't work here. Nothing works here. Please, just get back in your plane and fly away. Dr. Park was studying my face carefully. When did you last sleep? When did you last eat? I realized how I must look to them. Unshaven, wild-eyed, talking about monsters in the ice. They thought I was having some kind of breakdown. I know how this sounds, I said, but in about 5 minutes, you're going to see holes opening in the ice around us, and things are going to come out of those holes. What kind of things? Dr. Chen asked, still using that patient tone. The Ayak people call them Yai, ice spirits. They've been frozen here since the last ice age, but something's waking them up. The climate change, maybe. The ice getting warmer. Dr. Park pulled out a radio device I'd never seen before. Base, this is Dr. Park. We've encountered a park ranger who appears to be in distress, requesting medical advice. The radio crackled to life immediately. Clear, perfect reception. Copy that, Dr. Park. What's his condition? I stared at the radio. How is that working? Standard equipment, Dr. Chen said. Sir, why don't you sit down? You look exhausted. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was watching the ice around us. The gray color was starting to spread outward from our position, like ripples in a pond. The creatures were waking up again, drawn by the presence of new victims. Dr. Park, I said quietly, I need you to do exactly what I say. Walk slowly toward your plane. Don't run, don't make any sudden movements, but get ready to take off. Mr. Thornton, look at the ice under your feet. Dr. Park looked down. Her expression changed as she noticed the gray tint spreading across the white surface. What's causing that? Them, I said. The first hole opened about 50 feet away. A perfect circle, just like before. Dr. Chen stumbled backward as the ice around his feet became transparent. What the hell? He whispered. More holes appeared. 10, 20, 50. The glacier was turning into Swiss cheese around us, and from deep in those holes, the singing began. Dr. Park grabbed Dr. Chen's arm. We need to go. Now. But it was too late. The blue figures were already climbing out of the holes. This time was different. This time, the doctors could see them. Oh my God, Doctor. Park breathed. The creatures moved with more purpose now, more intelligence. They spread out in a circle around us, cutting off our escape route to the plane. But they didn't attack. They just stood there, watching us with those infinite black eyes. The largest one, the first one I'd seen, stepped forward. When it spoke, its voice was like wind through ice caves. You will see, it said. The warm time kills everything. The ice melts, the waters rise, all the green places drown. We show you true. Dr. Chen was fumbling with scientific instruments, trying to record what was happening. This is impossible. The temperature readings, the electromagnetic signatures, shut up and listen, I said. The creature raised one blue hand, and suddenly, I wasn't standing on a glacier anymore. I was, floating above the earth, seeing it from space. But it wasn't the earth I knew. The ice caps were gone. The coastlines had moved hundreds of miles inland. Vast areas of what used to be land were covered by dark ocean water. Cities I recognized were underwater. New York, Miami, Amsterdam, Bangkok. Millions of people trying to escape the rising waters, but there was nowhere to go. The vision shifted. I saw the Malaspina Glacier, but it was different, smaller, broken. Instead of a solid wall of ice, it was scattered chunks, floating in a dark sea. This is your future, the creature said. 50 of your winters, maybe less. The vision changed again. Now I was seeing the past. The same glacier, but massive beyond imagination. Ice covering most of North America, stretching from the Arctic to what would someday be the American Midwest. And in that ice, sleeping, waiting, were millions of the blue creatures. "We are the memory of winter," the creature said. "When the great cold came, we went into the ice to wait. We thought winter would return, as it always had. But this warm time is different. This time, the ice will not come back." I was back on the glacier, standing between the two terrified researchers. The creatures were closer now, forming a tight circle around us. "Why are you showing us this?" Dr. Park asked, her voice shaking. "Because you are the ones who study the ice," the creature said. "You are the ones who know the truth, but do not speak it loud enough. The warm time comes because your people choose comfort over survival. You burn the old carbon. You melt our sleep." Dr. Chen stepped forward, his scientific mind still working despite the terror. "You're trying to prevent climate change?" The creature's laugh was like ice breaking. "Too late for prevention. We show you the true path. Join us in the ice, sleep through the warm time, wake when winter returns." "And if we refuse?" I asked. "Then you burn with your world." The singing grew louder. The other creatures began to move closer. I could feel the cold radiating from their bodies, a supernatural cold that had nothing to do with air temperature. "The woman who was here before," I said. "What happened to her?" "She saw the truth. She chose the ice. You killed her. We gave her peace." That's when I understood. They weren't trying to save the world. They were trying to save themselves. By converting humans, by bringing us into the ice with them, they could preserve their own existence through the coming warm age. Dr. Park was backing toward the plane, moving slowly like I'd told her, but the creatures moved to block her path. "There's no escape," the lead creature said. "You have seen, you know the truth. Choose." I looked around at the circle of blue faces, all sad and ancient and completely without mercy. Then I looked at the two researchers who'd stumbled into this nightmare because they wanted to study ice. In my jacket pocket, I had something I'd forgotten about. Emergency flares. Standard equipment for glacier work, in case you needed to signal for rescue. Magnesium flares. They burn at over 3,000 degrees. "I choose," I said, pulling the first flare from my pocket. The creatures started to move toward me, but I was faster. I pulled the pin and threw the flare at the nearest one. The magnesium light hit the blue creature in the chest, and it screamed. Not with sound, but with cold so intense it felt like being stabbed with icicles. Where the flare touched, the creature began to dissolve, its ice body melting faster than should have been possible. "Run!" I shouted to the doctors. "Get to the plane!" I pulled the second flare and threw it at the creature, blocking their path. Same result, YF, screaming, melting, dissolution. The other creatures backed away from the light and heat, their forms flickering like they were struggling to maintain cohesion. Dr. Park and Dr. Chen ran for the plane. I followed, pulling my third and final flare, but the creatures were regrouping, and I could see more climbing out of the holes across the glacier, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. 3 flares against an army of ice monsters. Not good odds. The doctors reached the plane, and Dr. Chen started the engine while Dr. Park held the door open for me. I was 50 yards away when the lead creature stepped into my path. "You cannot stop what comes," it said. "The warm time will kill everything you love." "Maybe," I said, pulling the pin on the last flare. "But I'm not going quietly." I threw the flare, not at the creature, but at the largest hole behind it. The magnesium light disappeared into the depths, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, the ice began to crack. The heat from the flare was spreading through the glacier's internal structure, causing rapid expansion and contraction. Stress fractures appeared everywhere, running in all directions like a spider web. The creatures looked around in panic as their home began to break apart. I ran for the plane as the glacier shook beneath my feet. Behind me, I could hear the creatures screaming as their ice prison collapsed. Some were falling back into the holes, others were dissolving as the temperature changes destroyed their physical forms. I dove into the plane just as Dr. Chen gunned the engine. We lifted off as the entire glacier system began to collapse beneath us. From the air, I could see the extent of the damage. Miles of ice were cracking and falling apart, creating a massive calving event that would be felt for hundreds of miles. And in the churning ice and water below, blue lights flickered and went out one by one. But not all of them. The official report said it was a seismic event. A minor earthquake triggered a massive glacier collapse in the Malaspina region. The scientists from the University of Alaska backed up my story about the ground instability and the need for immediate evacuation. They were heroes for getting us all out safely. That was 6 months ago. I retired from the Park Service the following week. 18 years of service, full pension, no questions asked. My superiors were understanding about the stress of the incident. Glacier collapse is traumatic. Sometimes rangers need time to recover. I moved to a small town in Oregon where it's warm and dry and as far from ice as I can get in the continental United States. I work at a hardware store now, selling screws and paint to people who are building normal lives in a normal world. But I still dream about the ice. Dr. Park and Dr. Chen published their findings about the glacier collapse. They presented it as a cautionary tale about climate change acceleration in Arctic regions. The data they collected showed temperature anomalies that couldn't be explained by normal weather patterns. They recommended increased monitoring of glacier stability throughout Alaska. They never mentioned the blue creatures. Neither did I. But sometimes, late at night, I get emails from Dr. Park. She sends me articles about strange ice formations in Greenland, unexplained holes appearing in glaciers across the Arctic, local people reporting singing sounds coming from deep in the ice. The Yai weren't just in Alaska. They're everywhere. The ice is deep and old, and as the climate warms, as more glaciers become unstable, they're waking up all over the world. Last week, I got a call from my old supervisor at the Park Service. 3 researchers had gone missing on the Juneau ice field. Their last radio transmission mentioned strange acoustic phenomena and unusual ice coloration. "I know you're retired," he said, "but we could really use someone with your experience." I told him I wasn't available. The truth is, I think about going back sometimes. I think about the woman who fell into the hole, and about all the other people who are probably walking into similar traps as the creatures spread. The Yai were right about one thing. Climate change is accelerating faster than anyone wants to admit. The ice is melting everywhere, and as it melts, ancient things are waking up. Things that remember when the world was different. Things that have been sleeping since the last ice age, waiting for their chance to ensure they'll survive the next one. But I also remember what the lead creature said. Too late for prevention. Maybe they were right about that too. Maybe the best we can do now is try to survive what's coming. I keep a box of emergency flares in my closet, just in case. Magnesium burns hot enough to melt ice, no matter how old or how supernatural. It's probably not much of a defense against an army of ice prophets, but it's something. Sometimes, on particularly cold nights, I think I can hear singing in the distance. Low and harmonious, like whale songs but older. Much older. The Yai are still out there, in glaciers across the world, still waking up, still trying to save themselves from the warm time by converting humans to their cause. Still showing people visions of the future they claim is inevitable. Maybe they're right about the future. Maybe the oceans will rise and the cities will drown and the ice will never come back. Maybe the world really is ending, one melted glacier at a time. But even if that's true, even if we're all headed for the same drowning future, I know one thing for certain. I'm not going into the ice willingly. Some people might choose the eternal cold sleep the Yai offer. Some people might decide that joining the ice prophets is better than facing an uncertain future in a warming world. But not me. I'll take the uncertain future. I'll take the risk of drowning cities and rising seas and all the chaos that climate change might bring. Because at least it's a human future. Whatever happens, the Yai can keep their prophecies and their frozen dreams. I'll stick with the warm time, as long as it lasts. Even if they're right about what's coming, even if the world really is ending, I'd rather face it with my eyes open and my feet on solid ground. Not frozen in ice, dreaming of winter, but on the coldest nights, when the wind rattles my windows in this safe, warm town far from any glacier, I still hear them singing. And I know they're still out there, waiting in the ice. Still calling to anyone brave enough or desperate enough to listen. Still offering their cold salvation to a world that's burning itself alive. The ice remembers everything, and it never forgets. My name is Samuel Blackhorse, and I'm a park ranger. For 14 years, I've worked in some of the most remote places on Earth, but nothing prepared me for what happened at Kobuk Valley National Park in September of 1986. Most people don't know Alaska has a desert, but there it is, 100 miles above the Arctic Circle, 25 square miles of sand dunes that look like they belong in the Sahara, not in a place where winter lasts 8 months. The Great Kobuk Sand Dunes sit in a valley surrounded by spruce forests and tundra, a golden sea of shifting sand that makes no sense in this frozen world. I grew up in Arizona, on the Navajo Nation, so deserts didn't scare me. Sand was sand, whether it was hot or cold. That's what I thought, anyway. The Inupiat elders who lived near the park had different ideas. They called the dunes siku swimmers, a place where things moved through sand like fish through water. Old stories, I figured. Every wild place has its legends. I was wrong. My job that September was routine maintenance, checking weather stations, documenting sand movement, making sure the few hiking trails were safe. The park gets maybe 50 visitors a year, and most of those come in summer. By September, I had the whole place to myself, which was exactly how I liked it. The first snow had fallen 2 nights before I arrived. Not much, just enough to dust the tops of the dunes with white. The contrast was beautiful. Golden sand valleys with white peaks, like someone had sprinkled powdered sugar on desert mountains. I'd brought camping gear for a week-long survey, planning to document how the early snow affected sand stability. I set up camp near the center of the dune field, in a sheltered spot between 2 large ridges. The silence was complete. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just the soft whisper of sand grains settling as the dunes slowly shifted in the thin Arctic air. That first night, I made dinner on my camp stove, watched the aurora dance overhead. Green curtains of light rippled across the star-filled sky, reflecting off the snow-dusted sand. It was peaceful, beautiful. I fell asleep thinking about how lucky I was to see places like this, places where humans were just temporary visitors. I should have paid attention to why the place was so quiet. The next morning, I woke to strange tracks around my tent. Not animal tracks, at least not like any I'd seen before. They were smooth grooves in the sand, about 3 feet wide, as if something large had been dragging itself in circles around my campsite. The grooves had no beginning or end. They just appeared and disappeared, as if whatever made them had emerged from deep sand, circled my tent, and then vanished back into the earth. I examined the tracks carefully. The sand inside the grooves was packed differently than the surrounding surface, denser, with a strange oily sheen. When I touched it, my fingers came away damp, even though no moisture should exist in this dry environment. My first thought was equipment. Maybe the Park Service had done some kind of survey work I didn't know about, some kind of drilling or soil sampling that left unusual marks. But the grooves curved and twisted in ways that made no mechanical sense. And they were fresh. The fine layer of snow that had fallen during the night was undisturbed on either side of the tracks. I photographed everything, then followed one of the grooves to see where it led. After about 50 yards, the track simply stopped at the base of a small dune, not gradually, abruptly, as if whatever made it had dove straight down into the sand and disappeared. That's when I noticed something else. The sand around the groove's end was moving slightly, shifting and settling in tiny avalanches, as if something large was moving underneath. I knelt and pressed my ear to the surface. Deep below, I heard movement. A sliding, rushing sound, like water, flowing through underground pipes. But this was sand, not water. Sand doesn't flow like that. Sand doesn't move in currents and streams 30 feet below the surface. I stood up quickly, suddenly aware of how isolated I was. The nearest town was 80 miles away. The nearest person was probably twice that distance. If something happened to me out here, it would be weeks before anyone came looking. But I'm a scientist, a professional. Weird tracks and underground sounds didn't mean anything supernatural was happening. There had to be a logical explanation. Underground water flow, maybe. Or some kind of geological process I didn't understand. The Arctic had strange permafrost patterns that could create unusual ground movement. I decided to continue my survey work and keep documenting anything unusual. That was my job, to observe and record, not to run from things I didn't immediately understand. I wish I had run. The second day, I climbed to the top of the highest dune to get photos of the entire area. The view was incredible. Rolling waves of sand stretching to the horizon, broken only by patches of snow and the dark line of spruce forest in the distance. But as I stood there, adjusting my camera, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The tracks weren't just around my campsite, they were everywhere. From this height, I could see dozens of the smooth grooves crisscrossing the dune field like a giant highway system. They ran in long curves and spirals, connecting areas of disturbed sand that looked like feeding grounds. That was the only way I could describe them. Circular areas where the sand was churned and mixed, as if something had been thrashing around beneath the surface. I spent the rest of the morning following the track system, mapping it in my notebook. The pattern was too organized to be natural, too purposeful to be random geological movement. Whatever was making these tracks was intelligent. That afternoon, I was taking soil samples from one of the churned areas when I found the first body. It was a caribou, or what was left of one. The animal was buried in sand up to its neck, but it hadn't died from suffocation. Its body was completely drained, not of blood, but of moisture. The carcass was mummified, dried to leather and bone, as if it had been in the desert for months instead of days. But the strangest part was its position. The caribou was standing upright, legs planted firmly in the sand, as if it had been grazing when something grabbed it from below and held it there while it died. The animal's eyes were gone, leaving empty sockets filled with sand. Its mouth hung open in what looked like a final scream. I photographed everything, then tried to excavate around the body to see how deep it went. The sand was packed hard as concrete around the animal's legs. When I finally managed to dig down a few feet, I found something that made me drop my shovel and back away. The caribou's legs were wrapped in some kind of organic material, thick, muscular coils that looked almost like tentacles or enormous earthworms. The coils were still slightly warm to the touch, and they contracted when I prodded them with a stick. Whatever had killed this animal was still attached to it, still down there in the sand, waiting. I grabbed my gear and moved away from the site quickly. But as I walked, I felt vibrations under my feet, deep thrumming movements that seemed to follow my footsteps. Something large was pacing me from below, tracking my movement across the surface. I stopped walking. The vibrations stopped. I took a step forward. The thrumming resumed. For the next hour, I played this terrifying game of tag with something I couldn't see. Every time I moved, it moved. Every time I stopped, it stopped. It was learning my patterns, staying directly underneath me no matter which direction I went. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I started running toward my campsite, sprinting across the soft sand as fast as I could manage. Behind me, the ground erupted in a line of sand spouts as something massive surged through the dunes, chasing me like a shark following a swimmer. I reached my tent and dove inside, zipping the entrance shut as if canvas could protect me from whatever was out there. For long minutes, I sat in the dark, listening to the sound of sand sliding and shifting around my campsite. Something was circling the tent, just below the surface. Then everything went quiet. I waited until dark before venturing outside. The tracks around my tent had multiplied. Dozens of grooves now surrounded my small camp in concentric circles, and at the center of each circle was a small pile of sand shaped like a miniature mountain. I approached one of the piles carefully. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't just sand. Mixed in with the grains were small bones, bits of fur, and what looked like pieces of antler. These were feeding sites. Whatever lived down there was bringing its kills to these spots and processing them somehow. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my tent with my flashlight, listening to the sounds of movement all around me. Sliding, rushing, digging sounds that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Whatever was down there wasn't just one creature. It was many of them, and they were getting more active as the temperature dropped. Around 3 a.m, something touched the bottom of my tent. I felt it through my sleeping bag, a gentle pressure, as if something was prodding the tent floor from underneath. The pressure moved slowly along the length of my body, pressing up against my back, my legs, my head. Something was examining me through the thin barrier of canvas and sand. Then I heard it speak, not in English, not in any human language, but somehow I understood the meaning. It was asking me a question: what are you doing in our hunting ground? I didn't answer. I couldn't answer. I just lay there, paralyzed with fear, as the voice spoke again. This time it sounded like multiple voices, a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from all directions at once. Surface walker, why do you disturb the deep sand? Why do you mark our feeding grounds with your strange tools? Somehow, I found my voice. I'm a park ranger. I'm just doing my job. The pressure under my tent shifted, and I heard what might have been laughter, a sound like wind through dry leaves. Rangers guard things. What do you guard from us? I don't guard anything from you. I study the dunes, I take pictures and measurements. I don't hurt anything. The voices were quiet for a long time. Then, you smell of other places, hot sand, bright sun. You know desert things, but you do not know cold sand things. You do not know the siku swimmers. Siku swimmers? We who move through winter sand, as others move through summer water. We who sleep deep when the earth is hard, and hunt when the snow makes the sand soft. You walk on our roof. You wake us early. I tried to process what I was hearing. Were these things claiming to be the creatures from Inupiat legends, ancient spirits that lived in the sand dunes? I didn't know, I said. I didn't mean to wake you up. I can leave. Too late, the voices whispered. You have seen our work. You have marked our feeding grounds with your picture box. You carry knowledge of us to the outside world. The pressure under my tent was getting stronger, as if multiple creatures were pushing up from below. The canvas was starting to stretch and tear. Others have come before you, the voices continued. Others who walked on our roof and saw our work. They learned the deep sand ways. They learned to swim down instead of walking up. I thought about the caribou with its legs wrapped in muscular coils, slowly drained of life while held upright in the sand. That's what they meant. That's what happened to people who learned too much about the siku swimmers. The tent floor tore open with a sharp, ripping sound. I rolled out of my sleeping bag and grabbed my backpack, not bothering to pack anything except my camera and notebook. Behind me, thick serpentine shapes were pushing through the hole in the tent floor. Glistening, sand-covered coils that moved with impossible grace through the loose sand. I ran. The moon was bright enough to navigate by, and I headed toward the edge of the dune field, where the sand met solid ground. Behind me, I could hear the entire campsite being torn apart. My tent collapsed with a soft whoosh, followed by the sound of equipment being dragged down into the sand. But the real terror was what I felt under my feet as I ran. The vibrations were getting stronger, coming from multiple directions. The siku swimmers weren't just chasing me, they were surrounding me, coordinating their movements like a pack of wolves. The sand ahead of me erupted in a fountain of white and gold as something massive breached the surface. For a split second, I saw it clearly in the moonlight, a creature that looked like a cross between a giant earthworm and a sea serpent, 30 feet long and covered in overlapping scales that gleamed like wet sand. Its head was eyeless, but lined with sensing organs that twitched and moved as it tasted the air. The creature dove back into the sand before I could get a good photo, but its emergence had shown me something important. These things could only surface for short periods. They needed the sand like fish needed water. I changed direction, heading for a rocky outcrop I'd seen earlier. If I could reach solid ground, maybe I'd be safe. More creatures breached around me as I ran, their movements creating a wave effect in the sand like dolphins playing in the wake of a boat. There were at least 6 of them, possibly more. They seemed to be herding me, cutting off escape routes and forcing me toward the center of the dune field. I realized with growing horror that I was being driven toward one of the large feeding areas I'd mapped earlier, a place where the sand was churned and mixed, perfect for pulling prey down into the deep layers where the siku swimmers could feed in safety. The ground under my feet was getting softer, more yielding. Each step sank deeper into the sand, making it harder to run. Soon I was struggling through sand up to my knees, then my waist. The creatures had stopped chasing me because they didn't need to anymore. I was trapped in their feeding ground, slowly sinking into sand that behaved more like quicksand than the solid surface I'd been walking on all week. That's when I remembered something from my childhood in Arizona. My grandfather had taught me about desert survival, including how to escape from sand traps and flash flood deposits. The key was not to fight the sand, but to work with it. I stopped struggling and spread my body weight as evenly as possible, like floating on water. Instead of trying to climb out, I rolled sideways toward firmer ground, moving slowly and steadily without creating vibrations that would attract the creatures below. It worked. Gradually, I made my way to the edge of the feeding area, where the sand was more stable. But as I pulled myself onto firmer ground, I felt something grab my ankle. A thick, muscular coil had wrapped around my leg and was trying to pull me back into the soft sand. I could see the creature's body partially emerged from the surface. Scales that shifted color to match the sand and snow, powerful segments that contracted and expanded as it tried to drag me down. I grabbed a handful of snow from a nearby drift and pressed it against the creature's body. The reaction was immediate and violent. The coil released my ankle, and the creature thrashed wildly, diving deep into the sand to escape the cold moisture. Steam rose from where the snow had touched its scales. Water. They were vulnerable to water. I filled my water bottle with snow and melted it with my body heat as I continued toward the rocky outcrop. Every time I felt vibrations under my feet, I poured a small amount of water onto the sand. The creatures would retreat immediately, giving me space to keep moving. But I was running out of snow, and dawn was still hours away. I reached the rocky outcrop just as my water ran out. The stone was old granite, worn smooth by thousands of years of wind and weather. Most importantly, it was solid ground where the Siku swimmers couldn't reach me. I climbed to the top and looked back across the dune field. In the moonlight, I could see the sand moving in patterns that looked almost like a slow-motion whirlpool. The creatures were circling below the surface, waiting for me to come back down. That's when I understood what the Inupiat elders had been trying to tell people all along. The Great Kobuk Sand Dunes weren't just a geological formation. They were a habitat, an ecosystem as complex and dangerous as any coral reef or rainforest. And humans were not welcome. The Siku swimmers had evolved to live in this unique environment where desert conditions existed in an Arctic climate. They hunted during the brief periods when snow made the sand soft and mobile, then went dormant during the harsh winter months when everything froze solid. I had arrived at exactly the wrong time, when they were most active and most hungry. As I sat on the rock, reviewing my notes and photos by flashlight, I heard the voices again. But this time they sounded different, less threatening, more curious. Surface walker, you swim in air instead of sand. How do you float above the deep places? I looked around but couldn't see any creatures. They were speaking from somewhere below the rock, probably in underground tunnels that connected the entire dune system. I don't swim in air, I said. I walk on solid ground, on rock and dirt and hard surfaces. Show us, the voices whispered. Show you what? Show us how surface things work. You have the picture box. You take images of our work. Show us images of your work. I realized they wanted to see my photographs. They were intelligent enough to understand what a camera was, even if they'd never seen the pictures it produced. With shaking hands, I took out my camera and looked through the developed photos I'd taken over the past 2 days. The strange tracks, the feeding sites, the dried caribou carcass, evidence of their existence that no one would believe without seeing. These show your hunting grounds, I said, holding up the photos. Your tracks and feeding areas. The sand around the base of the rock began to move in agitated patterns. You will take these to other surface walkers, the voices said. You will bring many others to see our roof. Our hunting will be disturbed. Our sleep will be broken. No, I said quickly. I won't show these to anyone. I'll destroy them. I'll say I didn't find anything unusual. Lies, the voices hissed. Surface walkers always bring others. You cannot help your nature, just as we cannot help ours. The sand around the rock was rising now, forming small dunes that grew higher with each passing minute. The Siku swimmers were building a sand prison around my rocky refuge, trapping me on an island that was getting smaller as the walls grew higher. But they were making a mistake. All that sand movement was creating heat through friction, and the snow mixed in with the sand was beginning to melt. Small trickles of water were running down the sides of the growing sand walls. I started collecting the water in my empty bottle and any other container I could find. When I had enough, I stood at the edge of my rocky platform and poured the water down the sides of the sand walls. The effect was dramatic. The walls collapsed immediately as the creatures fled the water, diving deep to escape. But more importantly, I now understood how to get out of the dune field alive. "I want to make a deal," I called out to the voices. The sand movement stopped. "I'll destroy the photographs and never speak of what I've seen here, but you have to let me leave safely. And you have to promise not to hurt any other rangers or visitors who come here." "What do we gain from this bargain?" the voices asked. "Protection," I said. "I can make sure this place is designated as off-limits to tourists. I can arrange for it to be protected as sacred land that no one can develop or disturb. You'll be able to hunt and sleep in peace." The silence stretched on for several minutes. Finally, "How do we know you will keep this bargain?" I thought about the dried caribou, about the feeling of being stalked by something ancient and powerful, about the voices that spoke from deep sand. These creatures were part of an ecosystem that had existed for thousands of years before the first human set foot in Alaska. They had as much right to exist as any other wildlife. "Because I understand what you are now," I said. "You're not monsters, you're just trying to survive in a world that's changing too fast. I won't be the one to destroy that." The sand around the rock began to settle and smooth out. Slowly, carefully, I climbed down from my refuge. The ground felt solid under my feet again, and the vibrations had stopped. I walked across the dune field in the growing light of dawn, following my original tracks back toward where I'd left my camping gear. Most of it was buried or destroyed, but I managed to salvage enough supplies to make it to my pickup point. As I reached the edge of the dunes, I stopped and looked back one more time. The rising sun painted the sand in shades of gold and pink, and everything looked peaceful and empty. Just another beautiful wilderness area where nothing unusual ever happened. I exposed all my film to the light, destroying the photographs. Then I hiked to the landing strip where the bush pilot was scheduled to pick me up. I never filed a report about what happened in the Kobuk Dunes. My official documentation stated that the area showed normal seasonal changes with no unusual wildlife activity or geological features requiring further study. I recommended that the central dune field be designated as a restricted area to prevent damage to the fragile sand ecosystem. The Park Service accepted my recommendations without question. The Great Kobuk Sand Dunes were quietly reclassified as a research preserve with limited public access. Visitors were restricted to guided tours that stayed on the edges of the dune field, away from the central hunting grounds of the Siku swimmers. But keeping that promise came with a price I hadn't expected. For months after leaving the dunes, I had dreams about moving through sand as if it were water. I would wake up with the taste of grit in my mouth and the feeling that something was calling to me from far away. The dreams were so vivid that I started sleeping on the floor instead of my bed, curled up on hard surfaces that reminded me of rock instead of sand. My supervisor noticed the change in my behavior and recommended I take some time off. I spent 3 weeks in the desert near my childhood home, walking the familiar trails and trying to convince myself that sand was just sand. But even in the bright Arizona sun, I found myself listening for sounds from underground, watching for the telltale signs of something moving beneath the surface. The Siku swimmers had marked me somehow, not physically, but mentally. They had shared their underground world with me, and part of me would always be aware of the hidden places where things moved through earth as easily as birds moved through air. I returned to work eventually, but I never volunteered for assignments in sandy areas. I stuck to forests and mountains, places where the ground was solid and the only things moving underground were roots and worms. My colleagues thought I'd developed an aversion to desert work after too many years in hot climates. If only they knew. 3 years later, I heard about a research team that wanted to study the Kobuk Dunes for a documentary about Arctic ecosystems. They'd heard rumors of unusual geological features and wanted to investigate with ground-penetrating radar and deep core samples. I made some phone calls and had their permits denied. Told the Park Service that the area was too sensitive for that kind of intrusive research, that it might damage the delicate sand formations. It wasn't entirely a lie, but late at night, when the wind is blowing just right, I sometimes think I can hear voices carried on the air from 1,000 miles away. Whispers from the deep sand, thanking me for keeping our bargain, reminding me that some places on Earth belong to creatures older and stranger than anything we can imagine. The Siku swimmers are still out there, hunting in their golden wilderness above the Arctic Circle. They sleep through the long winters when the sand freezes hard as stone, and wake when the first snows make their world soft again. They remember the surface walker who kept his promise, and they honor our agreement. I hope they always will. Because sometimes, on nights when I can't sleep, I find myself planning a return trip to the Kobuk Dunes. Not as a ranger this time, but as something else. As someone who understands that there are different ways to move through the world, different ways to swim through substance and space. The dreams are getting stronger, the call is getting harder to ignore, and I'm starting to wonder if I really escaped from the sand dunes that September morning, or if I just convinced myself I had. The Siku swimmers are patient hunters. They can wait years for their prey to come to them willingly. I think I'm beginning to understand what that means. My name is Patricia Wolf, and I've been a park ranger for 21 years. People call me Pat. I work in Alaska's Chugach State Park, where the mountains rise like sleeping giants around Anchorage. Most folks think being a ranger means watching campfires and giving directions. For me, it's different. I listen to sounds. I used to be an acoustic engineer before I came here. Worked in Seattle, designing sound systems for concert halls. But after my divorce, I needed space. Alaska gave me that. The Park Service needed someone who understood how sound moves through mountain valleys. They got me. The Chugach Mountains are strange for sound. The valleys act like giant speakers, bouncing voices for miles. I've heard conversations from campers 3 valleys over. Ravens calling from peaks that look empty. Even my own voice coming back to me 10 minutes after I spoke. The local Dena'ina people have stories about these mountains. They talk about Geli, echo spirits that live in the rocks. Old Henry Wasili, who guides hunters through here, told me about them once. Voices that call from empty places. He said, they sound like people you know, but when you follow them, you never come back. I always smiled and nodded. Engineers believe in facts. Sound waves, frequency, amplitude. Not ghost stories. October came early in 1989. Snow fell in the high passes while the valleys still held green. I was making my weekly rounds through the Eagle River drainage, checking trail markers and weather stations. The forecast showed big storms coming from the Gulf of Alaska. 3 days of rain and wind. After that, winter would lock down the backcountry until spring. My truck radio crackled as I drove up the old mining road. Ranger Wolf, this is base. You copy? I copy, Sarah. What's up? Got a report of missing hikers. 2 college kids from UAA. Last seen Tuesday heading up Eagle River Trail. Parents are worried. Tuesday was 3 days ago. Any idea how far they went? They filed a plan to reach Echo Lake. 5-day trip. Echo Lake sits 12 miles back in the mountains. Deep country. The trail follows Eagle River through 3 major valleys, each one shaped like a bowl. Sound carries weird in those places. I'd recorded echoes there that lasted 30 seconds. Long enough to have a conversation with yourself. I'll head up and check, I told Sarah. Weather's turning, so if they're stuck somewhere. Be careful, Pat. Henry Wasili called this morning. Says the mountains are talking wrong lately. I almost laughed. Henry's grandfather was a shaman, and Henry grew up hearing every story the old people told. But he'd guided hunters and climbers for 40 years without losing anyone. If Henry thought something was strange, I paid attention. I loaded my pack with extra food, medical supplies, and my portable weather radio. My acoustic equipment went in too, a directional microphone, portable recorder, and frequency analyzer. If I found the hikers injured and couldn't reach them, sound might be my best tool for communication. The Eagle River Trail starts gentle. It follows the valley floor through spruce and birch forest. The river runs clear and cold, talking to itself over granite stones. Normal sounds. Bird calls, wind in trees, water over rocks. The kind of audio landscape I'd mapped dozens of times. 2 miles in, I found their first campsite. Clean spot by the river, fire ring properly built, no trash, good kids. The ashes were 3 days old, which matched their timeline. Boot prints in the mud showed 2 people, one bigger than the other, size 9 and size 7, both wearing hiking boots with deep tread. The prints headed upstream. The temperature was dropping. My breath started showing in small puffs. The sky looked gray and heavy, like snow was building up there. I needed to find these kids before the storm hit. 3 miles further, I reached the first acoustic anomaly zone. The valley narrowed into a funnel shape, with rock walls rising 300 feet on both sides. I called this spot the amplifier because it made every sound 10 times louder. Footsteps became thunder, a whisper carried for half a mile. I stopped to listen. The normal sounds were all there: river, wind, my own breathing, but something felt different. The quality of the echo had changed. Usually, when I clapped my hands in this spot, the echo came back clear and sharp. Now it sounded muddy, like the rock walls were tired. I recorded a few test sounds and played them back through my headphones. The frequency analysis looked normal. Maybe I was imagining things. The stress of looking for lost hikers could play tricks on your mind. But as I packed up my equipment, I heard something that made me freeze. "Pat? Pat, is that you?" A woman's voice, coming from up the trail, clear as day, like someone standing 50 feet away. But I could see the trail for a quarter-mile ahead, empty, nothing but rocks and trees. "Hello?" I called back. "Where are you?" "Nothing, just the river and wind." I waited 5 minutes, listening hard. Sometimes voices carry strange in these mountains. Sound can bounce off rock faces and come from directions that don't make sense. But I knew every acoustic trick in this valley. That voice had been close. Too close. I checked my watch. 2 o'clock, 4 hours of daylight left, and I still had 9 miles to cover. The hikers might be hurt, might be waiting for help. I couldn't waste time chasing phantom voices. But as I started walking again, part of my engineer brain stayed alert. Sound doesn't lie. Energy doesn't create itself. If I heard a voice, something made that voice. The question was what? The trail climbed steeper as I moved deeper into the mountains. Eagle River carved its way through granite cliffs that rose like cathedral walls. Every sound echoed. My boots on stone, the zip of my bring jacket, even my breathing. The acoustic signature kept changing as the valley shape shifted. Wide spots swallowed sound. Narrow chokes amplified everything. 4 miles in, I found their second campsite. This one looked different. The fire ring was built wrong, too big. Stones scattered like someone had kicked them. Their tent had been set up in a spot that would catch wind and water if it rained. These same kids who'd made a perfect camp 2 days earlier had suddenly forgotten everything they knew about wilderness camping. I knelt by the cold fire pit. The ashes were 2 days old, but something white caught my eye in the char. Paper. I pulled out a partially burned notebook page. Most of it was gone, but I could read a few words in blue ink. Hearing voices all night. Sarah keeps answering, but she's right here sleeping. Echoes coming too fast. Doesn't make sense. My skin went cold. Sarah was one of the hikers, a girl, and she was hearing voices too. I checked the ground around their campsite more carefully. 2 sets of boot prints led away from the site, but they didn't follow the trail. Instead, they headed straight up the valley wall, a steep climb through loose rock and thick brush. No experienced hiker would go that way. It was dangerous and led nowhere. I followed the prints for 50 yards. They stopped at a sheer rock face. Just stopped. Like the hikers had walked into solid stone and vanished. "What the hell?" I said out loud. My voice came back to me from 3 different directions. The echoes overlapped and mixed until they sounded like other people talking, like a conversation I couldn't understand. I pulled out my recorder and spoke into it. "This is Patricia Wolf, Eagle River Trail, Mile 4. Time is 3:15 p.m., October 12th, 1989. I'm following tracks that end at a rock face." I played it back immediately. My voice sounded normal on the recording, but when I spoke those same words out loud again, the echoes came back distorted, stretched out, like the mountain was chewing on my words before spitting them back. I tried to think like an engineer. Sound was energy moving through air. It bounced off surfaces according to physics. Angle of incidence equals angle of reflection. The shape of surfaces determined frequency response. Everything had a scientific explanation, but I'd never heard echoes that sounded tired before. I backtracked to the trail and kept climbing. The hikers had to be somewhere ahead. Maybe they'd gotten confused, followed the wrong path, doubled back. People made mistakes in the wilderness. Panic could make you do stupid things. At mile 6, the trail entered the second acoustic zone. The valley opened into a huge natural bowl, maybe a mile across. Steep walls rose on all sides, creating what acoustic engineers call a parabolic reflector. It focused sound like a satellite dish. I'd tested this spot before and measured echoes that lasted 45 seconds. The silence hit me first. No river sounds. Eagle River split into small creeks up here, too quiet to hear. No wind in the trees. No bird calls. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, like the air itself was thick. I stopped in the center of the bowl and clapped my hands. The echo should have been massive, rolling around the walls like thunder. Instead, I heard a weak clap that died fast, like the rock walls were absorbing the sound instead of reflecting it. That was impossible. Granite doesn't absorb sound. It's one of the most reflective materials in nature. I set up my equipment and ran a full acoustic analysis. The frequency response looked normal on my instruments, but when I generated test tones through my speaker, they sounded flat and dead, like playing music in a padded room. Test tone, 440 Hz, I said into my recorder. The playback sounded fine through headphones. But when I spoke the same words out loud, something answered from across the bowl. Test tone, 440 Hz. My voice, but not my voice. Same words, same rhythm, but the tone was different, colder, like someone had recorded me speaking and played it back through a broken radio. I keyed my radio. Bass, this is Ranger Wolf. Do you copy? Static. Nothing but white noise. Bass, this is Patricia. Can anyone hear me? More static. The radio worked fine 3 miles back. Now it was dead. GPS units could fail in deep valleys, but radios usually worked unless the weather was really bad. The sky was gray, but no storm yet. I was truly alone out here. No communication, no backup, and the acoustic environment was behaving like nothing I'd studied in 21 years. Then I heard the voices. Pat, up here. A man's voice, coming from the south wall of the bowl. Clear and urgent, like someone in trouble. Pat, we're hurt. A woman now, from the north wall. Different direction entirely. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the cliff faces, through binoculars. Nothing. No movement, no people, no place where anyone could be calling from. The voices sounded close, maybe 200 yards, but the nearest ledge where someone could stand was half a mile up sheer rock. Where are you? I shouted. Here, can't you see us? The man's voice again, but this time from directly overhead. I looked up at empty sky and cloud. We're hurt bad, please help. The woman, now from behind me. I spun around. Still nothing. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my recorder. I had to document this. Evidence. Proof that something impossible was happening. Time is 4:30 p.m. I'm hearing voices from multiple directions, but visual contact is negative. Voices claim to be injured hikers, asking for help. I played it back through headphones. My voice was steady, professional. But as soon as I spoke those words out loud for real, the answers came. Pat, don't leave us. We're dying up here. Why won't you help? Us? The voices were getting closer. Clearer. They sounded exactly like real people in real distress. My training said to follow voices, to help anyone who needed rescue. But my eyes said no one was there. I forced myself to think like an engineer. Sound waves could be reflected and refocused by rock formations. Maybe the voices were coming from miles away, bounced and concentrated by the bowl shape. Maybe the real hikers were calling for help from somewhere I couldn't see. But that didn't explain why my radio was dead, or why my test equipment was reading normal while my ears heard impossible things. I started walking toward the trail that led out of the bowl. Whatever was happening here, I needed to get to higher ground, restore radio contact, call for backup. Pat, don't go. The woman's voice again, right behind me now. So close, I should feel her breath on my neck. I didn't turn around. I kept walking, boots crunching on gravel, heart hammering against my ribs. Something was very wrong in this valley. Something that had nothing to do with missing hikers, or weather patterns, or acoustic anomalies. The old Denaina stories whispered in the back of my mind. Geli, echo spirits, voices that call from empty places. But I was a scientist. I believed in facts. At least, I used to. The trail up from the bull was steep and narrow. I climbed fast, trying to put distance between myself and those impossible voices. My lungs burned in the thin air, but I didn't slow down. Something in that acoustic bull had been wrong in ways my training couldn't explain. At 5,800 feet, I reached a small plateau where the trail split. One path led to Echo Lake, still 3 miles ahead. The other curved around the mountain toward a series of smaller valleys. According to my topo map, both paths eventually connected near the lake. I stopped to check my radio again, still dead. But my GPS was working. It showed my exact position on the digital map. Battery levels were fine on all my equipment. Nothing was broken. The radio just wouldn't transmit or receive. I pulled out the partially burned notebook page I'd found at the hiker's second campsite. In daylight, I could read a few more words. Sarah keeps answering, but she's right here sleeping. Echoes coming too fast. Doesn't make sense. They know our names. They know our names. My mouth went dry. I'd been assuming the voices were just some kind of acoustic phenomenon. Sound waves behaving strangely in the mountain valleys. But acoustic anomalies don't know people's names. I folded the paper and put it back in my pocket. The smart thing would be to head back down the mountain, get to a place where my radio worked, call for backup, let a full search and rescue team handle this. But 2 college kids were still missing. If they were hurt, they might not survive another night. The temperature was dropping fast, and the storm would hit by morning. I chose the main trail toward Echo Lake. The path followed a narrow ridge between 2 deep valleys. On my left, Eagle River carved its way through granite walls. On my right, a smaller drainage called Whisper Creek wound through dense forest. I'd named it Whisper Creek because of how sound carried there. The creek bed acted like a natural speaking tube, carrying voices for miles. As I hiked, I started hearing things again. Not the clear voices from the bull, but softer sounds. Whispers. Conversations just at the edge of understanding. They seemed to come from Whisper Creek Valley, floating up through the trees. I stopped every few minutes to listen. The sounds were definitely human voices, but too distant to make out words, like hearing a party through a wall. Normal sound carries strangely in mountains, I told myself. Campers in the valley below, their voices bouncing up the rock walls. But I could see down into Whisper Creek Valley through my binoculars. No camps, no people. No signs of human activity at all. The whispers kept following me. At mile 8, I found something that stopped me cold. A piece of bright orange fabric tied to a tree branch. Standard trail marker, but not one of mine. The Park Service used yellow markers. Search and rescue teams used red. I untied the fabric and examined it. High-quality nylon, the kind used in expensive outdoor gear. One corner was torn and stained with something dark. Not mud. Blood. More orange markers appeared every 100 yards along the trail. Someone was leaving a trail, but the markers led away from the main path, down into Whisper Creek Valley. I followed them. The descent was steep and treacherous. Loose rocks skittered away under my boots. Tree roots tried to trip me. But the orange markers continued, always visible, always leading deeper into the valley. The whispers grew louder as I descended, multiple voices now, overlapping and mixing. I caught fragments, single words, that sounded familiar. My name. Help. Lost. Cold. A quarter-mile down, I found their 3rd campsite. This one was a disaster. The tent was shredded, hanging in tatters from broken poles. Sleeping bags were scattered and torn open, their down filling floating in the wind like snow. Food containers were smashed and empty. It looked like bears had destroyed everything. But there were no bear tracks. Only human boot prints, the same size 9s and 7s I'd been following all day. I searched through the wreckage. Most of their gear was ruined, but I found a camera with film still in it. The last few shots might tell me what happened. I also found a notebook, water-stained but readable. The handwriting was shaky, like someone writing in a hurry or in the dark. Day 3. Can't sleep. Voices all night. Sarah says she hears her dead brother calling. But Tom died 2 years ago. I keep hearing my mom, but she's in Seattle. The echoes are wrong. They answer before we speak. They know things they shouldn't know. Day 3. Later, trail markers appeared this morning. Orange cloth, leading down toward the creek. We didn't put them there. No other hikers in this area. But someone wants us to follow. Day 3. Afternoon. Following the markers, Sarah says we should go back. But the voices are promising help. They sound so real, so close, just need to follow them to where the people are waiting. The notebook ended there. I looked around the destroyed campsite. The orange markers continued down the valley, following Whisper Creek toward its headwaters. The hikers had been led here by voices they thought belonged to real people, just like I was hearing voices now. Pat. I spun around. A woman's voice, clear as day, coming from downstream along the creek. Pat, we found them. A man's voice now, from upstream. They're hurt but alive. You need to come help. The voices sounded like other park rangers. People I worked with. Professional, calm, competent. The kind of voices you trusted in an emergency. But I was alone in this valley. The nearest ranger was 30 miles away. I pulled out my recorder with shaking hands. Time is 6:45 p.m. I'm at the hikers' destroyed campsite in Whisper Creek Valley, hearing voices claiming to have found the missing hikers. When I played it back, my voice sounded terrified. But when I spoke those same words out loud, the responses came immediately. Pat, stop wasting time with that recorder. People are dying while you stand there talking to yourself. Follow the markers. We're waiting. The voices knew about my recorder. They were responding to what I said in real time, like a conversation. This wasn't acoustic reflection or atmospheric phenomena. This was something that could hear me, understand me, and respond. Something intelligent. I started backing away from the creek, toward the trail that led up the valley wall. Every instinct screamed at me to run. Get out of this valley, get back to civilization, let someone else deal with whatever was happening here. But as I turned to climb, I saw something that made me freeze. Fresh orange markers, leading up the opposite side of the valley, a path I hadn't seen on my way down. And at the tree line, maybe half a mile up the slope, 2 small figures in bright clothing, moving slowly like people who were hurt. The missing hikers. There, called a voice from the creek. Do you see them now? I raised my binoculars. 2 people, definitely. One in a red jacket, one in blue. Moving carefully across a steep meadow, heading for what looked like a cave entrance in the cliff face. They're hypothermic, said another voice. Need medical attention immediately. Follow the markers, Pat. We'll guide you. I looked at the fresh orange trail markers leading up the valley wall. They hadn't been there when I descended. I was sure of it, but now they glowed bright against the green forest, a clear path to where the hikers were struggling across the meadow. My training said to go. People needed help. That's what rangers did. But something Henry Wassily had told me echoed in my mind. When you follow them, you never come back. The figures on the mountainside stopped moving and turned toward me. Too far away to make out faces, but I could see them waving, calling for help in voices that carried clearly across half a mile of open valley. Pat, hurry, we're so cold. Please don't leave us. I had to choose. Follow my training and try to rescue the hikers, or trust the growing certainty that something was hunting in these mountains, something that used human voices as bait. The storm clouds were building overhead, temperature dropping fast. In 2 hours it would be full dark. I started climbing toward the orange markers, because even if the voices were lies, those 2 figures on the mountainside looked real. And I couldn't live with myself if I let 2 college kids die because I was afraid of ghost stories. The Geli had found their perfect trap. They were using my own duty, my own compassion, against me, and it was working. The climb toward the orange markers was brutal. The valley wall rose at a 40-degree angle through loose scree and thick brush. Every step sent rocks skittering down behind me. My lungs burned, and sweat soaked my shirt despite the cold air. But I kept climbing because the figures on the mountainside were real. Through binoculars, I could see them clearly now. A young man in a red jacket, a young woman in blue. They moved slowly, helping each other across the steep meadow. No question, these were the missing UAA students. The orange markers led me on a zigzag path up the slope. Whoever placed them knew the mountain well. They found the safest route through dangerous terrain, avoiding cliffs and rockslide areas. But I hadn't seen anyone place these markers. They'd appeared like magic. Good, Pat, you're almost there. The voice came from above me. A Park Service radio voice, professional and calm. But when I looked up, I saw only rock and trees. They're in bad shape, hypothermia and exhaustion. Another voice, this one sounding like Dr. Martinez from the Anchorage Medical Center. Someone who'd know about cold weather injuries. But Dr. Martinez was 30 miles away in his warm office. Keep following the markers. We'll have them stabilized by the time you arrive. The voices were coordinated now. Multiple speakers, all claiming to be rescue personnel who'd somehow reached the hikers ahead of me. But I was the only ranger in this area. No other teams were responding to this call. I reached the tree line as the last daylight faded. The temperature had dropped below freezing. My breath came out in thick clouds. Snow began falling, light flakes that melted on my jacket. Ahead, the two hikers had reached what looked like a cave entrance in the cliff face. A natural shelter from the storm. Smart move if they were hypothermic. "Pat, over here!" The woman in blue was waving at me from the cave mouth. Her voice carried clearly across the meadow, even though she was 200 yards away. At this distance, in this wind, I shouldn't be able to hear normal speech. I approached carefully, all my senses on high alert. The acoustic environment was wrong again. Too quiet, despite the wind. Too clear, despite the distance. Sound was behaving impossibly. The cave entrance was bigger than it looked from below. 8 feet high, 12 feet wide, disappearing into darkness. The two hikers sat just inside, wrapped in sleeping bags. They looked exhausted but alive. "Thank God you found us," said the young man in red. "I'm Jake, this is Sarah. We got lost 3 days ago." Sarah nodded weakly. "Followed some trail markers that led us down into the wrong valley. Been trying to find our way back, ever, since. They looked real, they sounded real. Every detail was perfect. The right ages, the right gear, the right level of exhaustion for people who'd been lost in the wilderness. But something was wrong with their eyes. In the dim light, they looked too bright, too reflective, like animal eyes caught in headlights. "We need to get you down to medical care," I said, unslinging my pack. "Can you walk?" "We think so," Jake said. "But there's something you need to know first." "The voices," Sarah added. "They're not what you think." I froze with my medical kit half open. "What do you mean?" Jake pointed deeper into the cave. "There are others back there, people who followed the voices, just like us, just like you. They've been here a long time," Sarah whispered. My flashlight beam played across the cave walls as I stepped deeper inside. The passage opened into a larger chamber, maybe 30 feet across. And there, scattered around the walls, I saw them. Bodies. Dozens of bodies. Some recent, some old enough to be just bones and scraps of clothing. Hikers, hunters, climbers, all arranged in sitting positions with their backs against the cave walls, facing inward like they were listening to something. My light found faces, frozen in expressions of concentration. Some still had flesh, preserved by the cold and dry air. Others were skulls with empty sockets. But all of them had their mouths open, like they'd been speaking when they died. "Jesus Christ," I breathed. "The voices brought them here," Jake said behind me. "Just like they brought us, just like they brought you." I spun around, raising my flashlight. Jake and Sarah hadn't moved, but their eyes reflected the beam like mirrors. Bright silver discs where pupils should be. "You're not real," I said. Sarah smiled, and her teeth looked too sharp. "We're as real as sound waves, Pat. As real as echoes. As real as the voices you've been hearing all day." The truth hit me like cold water. The Geli weren't spirits that lived in rocks. They were entities made of sound itself. Parasites that fed on acoustic energy, that could create perfect audio illusions. They'd been calling to me all day, learning my voice, studying my reactions. "The bodies," I said, backing toward the cave entrance. "What happened to them?" "They listened," Jake said, his voice shifting into something deeper. "Older. They followed the voices until they found us. And then they stayed. Fed us," Sarah added, her voice becoming a harmony of multiple tones. "Their life energy, channeled through sound, through speech and breath and heartbeat. I could see it now. The acoustic properties of this cave were perfect for sound amplification. The Geli had found a natural resonance chamber where they could concentrate and feed. Every person they lured here became another voice in their collection." "That's how we knew your name," the thing wearing Jake's appearance said. We learned it from the others. From Henry Wassely's grandfather, who came here in 1952, from the hunting party that followed Voices in 1967, from the geology students who heard their professor calling in 1981. We know all their voices, Sarah's form added, all their words, all their memories of sound, the orange markers, the destroyed campsite, the radio dead zone. It had all been designed to herd me here, like a sheepdog driving prey towards slaughter. I pulled out my recorder and held it like a weapon. The Geli froze, their silver eyes fixed on the device. "What's wrong?" I said. "Afraid of your own voices played back?" "Electronics disrupt our resonance," Jake admitted. "But your batteries won't last forever." I checked the recorder's display, half power remaining. Maybe 2 hours of operation. "And when they die," Sarah said, "you'll hear us perfectly. You'll listen to us sing. You'll want to stay and add your voice to ours." I had to get out of the cave. Back to open air, where sound could disperse, where their acoustic trap couldn't hold me. But the entrance was 50 feet away, and the Geli were between me and freedom. I played back my recorded voice at full volume. Time is 6:45 p.m. I'm at the hikers' destroyed campsite. The fake Jake and Sarah screamed and covered their ears. The sound of my own recorded voice seemed to cause them physical pain. Their forms flickered and wavered like mirages. I ran for the entrance. Behind me, the cave filled with voices, dozens of them, all the people the Geli had consumed over the years. They called my name, begged me to stay, promised to help me if I'd just turn around and listen. But I kept running, playing my recorded voice on loop. The electronic playback created interference with their acoustic illusions, breaking their hold on the cave's resonance. I burst out into the snowy night and started down the mountainside. No trail now, just a steep descent through loose rock and wind-bent trees. I fell a dozen times, skinning my knees and palms, but I didn't stop. The voices followed me down the mountain. They came from every direction, the trees, the rocks, the air itself, all the people the Geli had learned to mimic over decades of hunting. "Pat, where are you going? We need your help. Don't leave us here. You can't escape sound, Patricia. It's everywhere." My recorder battery died halfway down. The voices surged closer, more real, more convincing. I heard my ex-husband calling, my mother, my dead father, perfect reproductions of people I'd loved, begging me to turn around. But I knew the truth now. Sound without a source was impossible. Voices that knew things they shouldn't were supernatural. I was an engineer, and I believed in facts. The fact was that something inhuman lived in these mountains, and it was hunting me. I reached the main trail and ran through the darkness toward the trailhead. Behind me, the voices grew fainter but never stopped. They would follow me all the way down. The Geli had found their perfect prey, someone who made a living listening to sounds, but they'd made one mistake. They'd shown me their true nature, and now I knew how to fight back. I reached my truck at 3 a.m., hypothermic and bleeding from a dozen falls. My radio worked perfectly once I got out of the valley. I called for backup, medical support, and a full search and rescue operation. "We need teams at Echo Lake by dawn," I told dispatch. "Multiple missing persons, possible fatalities. And bring acoustic equipment. Lots of it." The official report lists 7 bodies recovered from the cave at Echo Lake, hikers and climbers who disappeared over the past 40 years. The 2 UAA students were never found. The case remains open, marked as deaths by misadventure in challenging terrain. I told the truth in my initial report. Acoustic anomalies. Voices with no source. Entities that fed on sound energy. My supervisors quietly transferred me to desk duty pending psychological evaluation. Dr. Sarah Chen, the psychologist, was thorough and kind. "PTSD from wilderness trauma," she concluded. "Auditory hallucinations brought on by isolation and stress, completely treatable." I let her think that. It was easier than fighting the system, but I kept studying the acoustic properties of the Chugach Mountains, kept mapping sound patterns and frequency anomalies, kept tracking reports of missing hikers in valleys with unusual echo characteristics. The pattern was there if you knew how to look. Every 10 to 15 years, people disappeared near natural acoustic amplifiers, caves, bowl-shaped valleys, narrow canyons, always in places where sound behaved strangely. I built a database, cross-referenced missing persons reports with geological surveys, identified 17 locations across Alaska where the Geli might be hunting. Henry Wassily helped. His grandfather's stories filled in gaps in the historical record. The Dunaina had known about these entities for centuries. They called them Geli, sound thieves, voices that call from empty places. My grandfather said they sleep most of the time, Henry told me over coffee in his Anchorage kitchen. Only wake up when they get hungry. Usually that's every few years. How did your people fight them? Silence, he said simply. Drums filled with sand, thick furs over the ears. When you can't hear them, they can't hunt you. I started carrying noise-canceling headphones on every hiking trip, industrial grade, the kind aircraft mechanics use. When the voices started, I put them on and hiked by sight alone. It worked. I've crossed through 3 Geli territories since the Echo Lake incident. Each time, I saw the orange markers appear, heard voices calling my name, but the headphones blocked their acoustic influence. The entities tried other tricks, moving shadows that looked like people, fake footprints leading off trail, even physical sensations. Phantom touches on my shoulders, the feeling of someone walking behind me, but without their perfect audio illusions, they couldn't complete the hunt. I retired from the Park Service 2 years ago. Officially, it was medical retirement due to hearing damage from the Echo Lake incident. Unofficially, I'd become too much trouble, too many questions about acoustic anomalies, too many requests for equipment the brass didn't understand. Now I work as a private consultant. I help search and rescue teams understand how sound behaves in mountain terrain. I teach wilderness survival courses focused on audio awareness, and I monitor the missing persons reports from 17 specific valleys across Alaska. Last month, 3 hunters disappeared near Resurrection Creek. Same pattern. They filed a trip plan, made camp, then vanished. Searchers found shredded equipment and orange trail markers leading Steph up the valley walls. I drove down there with my equipment, set up audio monitors around the search area, played recordings of white noise and electronic interference through portable speakers. The Geli tried to call to me, but the electronic noise broke their concentration. They couldn't maintain clear illusions with that much audio interference. The search teams found the hunters' bodies in a cave system 2 miles up Resurrection Creek. 3 more names for my database. 3 more voices the Geli had learned to mimic. But the hunters' families got closure. The bodies came home for burial. Sometimes that's all we can do. People ask me if I believe in ghosts now. If the experience at Echo Lake changed my worldview, I tell them I believe in sound, energy that moves through air according to physical laws. But sometimes those laws get bent by things we don't understand yet. The Geli aren't supernatural. They're acoustic predators that evolved in environments humans rarely visit. Like anglerfish that use lights to hunt in the deep ocean, they use sound to hunt in mountain valleys. Understanding them doesn't make them less dangerous. It just gives us better tools to fight back. My acoustic monitoring network is small but growing. Park rangers in 12 states now carry the electronic interference devices I designed. When they hear voices that shouldn't exist, they flood the area with white noise until the anomalies stop. It works. Missing persons cases in monitored valleys have dropped by 70%. But the Geli are learning too. They're becoming more sophisticated, more careful. The newer cases show entities that can mimic electronic sounds, radio chatter, GPS signals, even cell phone rings. The war between sound and silence continues in the deep mountains. Most people never know it's happening. They hike and camp and climb, unaware that things hunt with voices in the places where echoes last too long. I know, though, I listen for the signs. And sometimes, late at night in my Anchorage apartment, I still hear my name being called from empty rooms. The voices remember me too. My name is Rebecca Northwind, but everyone calls me Becca. I've been a park ranger for 12 years now, working the wild coastline of Kotzebue Sound in Alaska. People think my job is all about telling tourists not to feed the bears, but out here, 45 miles from the nearest town, it's mostly about keeping folks alive in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. I used to be a Coast Guard rescue swimmer before this. Spent 8 years pulling people out of freezing water, so I know the ocean better than most. The Arctic Ocean doesn't forgive mistakes. Water this cold will kill you in minutes, and the currents can drag a body so far down you'll never find it. That's why I was so worried when the Kowalski family called me on the marine radio that July morning in 1984. Ranger Station, this is Campsite 12, came the shaky voice of Dan Kowalski. We need help. Our daughter, Emma, is missing. I grabbed my gear and headed out immediately. The Kowalskis had set up camp on a rocky beach about 10 miles from my station. Good spot for camping, sheltered from the wind, fresh water nearby, plenty of driftwood for fires. But it was right next to some of the deepest tidal pools in the Sound. When I arrived, I found Dan and his wife Sarah sitting by their tent, holding each other and crying. Emma was their only child, just 5 years old with bright blonde hair and the kind of smile that could melt ice. "Tell me exactly what happened," I said, pulling out my notebook. Sarah wiped her nose. "We were making breakfast this morning. Emma was playing by the water, picking up shells. She loves shells. How far was she from you?" "Maybe 20 feet, Dan said. "We could see her the whole time." Then Sarah went into the tent to get the coffee, and I was tending the fire. "When I came back out," Sarah continued, "she was gone. Just gone. We've been calling her name for 2 hours. I looked toward the water. The tide was coming in, covering the lower rocks with cold, dark waves. If Emma had fallen in, the current would have carried her out fast." "Did you hear anything? A splash or crying?" They looked at each other. Sarah spoke quietly. "We heard singing. Beautiful singing, like a woman's voice. We thought it was maybe someone on a boat passing by." "Did you see a boat?" "No." And the singing seemed to come from the water itself. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic air. In 12 years working these waters, I'd learned to listen when something felt wrong. And this felt very wrong. I called for a full search and rescue team. Within 3 hours, I had 2 dive boats and 6 experienced divers combing the waters around the campsite. We searched every tidal pool, every underwater cave, every piece of kelp forest where a small body might get caught. We found nothing. Not Emma, not her clothes, not even a single piece of evidence that she'd ever been near the water. It was like she'd simply vanished into thin air. But while we were searching, I noticed something strange. The water was cold, much colder than it should be in July. My thermometer read 42 degrees, a full 15 degrees below normal for this time of year. And the sea life was acting weird. Seals that usually lounged on the nearby rocks had disappeared. Even the seabirds had moved inland. "It's like everything's running away from something," said Mike Torres, one of the Coast Guard divers helping with the search. As the sun started to set, we called off the search for the day. The Kowalskis went back to town with the Coast Guard, heartbroken and confused. I stayed behind to do one more sweep of the area. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the wet sand leading from the campsite straight into the surf. Small footprints, the right size for a 5-year-old girl. They went into the water and never came back out. But here's what made my blood run cold. The footprints were perfectly preserved in the sand, even though the tide had come and gone twice since Emma disappeared. Nothing should last that long on this beach. I took photos and measurements, but I didn't tell anyone about them. Not yet. In my experience, when things don't make sense, it's better to keep quiet until you understand what you're dealing with. I spent that night in my cabin, staring at the photos and trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe Emma had sleepwalked. Maybe someone had taken her and made fake footprints to throw us off. Maybe the tides had been different than I thought. But deep down, I knew something else was happening here. Something that had nothing to do with normal drowning or kidnapping. I thought about the singing Sarah had mentioned, the way all the animals had fled the area, the impossible footprints. And I remembered the stories my grandmother used to tell me when I was little. Old Inupiaq stories, about things that lived in the deep water and stole children in the night. The next morning brought fog so thick I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. I was getting ready to resume the search when my radio crackled to life. "This is fishing vessel Northern Star," came an urgent voice. "We need immediate assistance. A child has gone missing from our boat." My heart sank. Not again. The Northern Star was anchored about a mile offshore with a family aboard, the Chens from Anchorage. 8-year-old Timothy Chen had disappeared sometime during the night while his father was fishing off the stern. I was right there, Mr. Chen told me, when I reached their boat. His hands were shaking. Timothy was sleeping in the cabin. Then around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps on deck. Did you go check? I called out, asked if he needed anything. He said he was just going to look at the water. I told him to be careful and went back to fishing. Mr. Chen's voice broke. When I turned around 20 minutes later, he was gone. Mrs. Chen spoke up from behind her husband. We heard the singing again. That same beautiful voice we heard yesterday at the campsite. My blood went cold. You were at the Kowalski campsite yesterday? We stopped by in the afternoon to ask if they'd seen any good fishing spots. They told us about their daughter. Such a tragedy. I organized another search, but this time I brought underwater cameras. If children were somehow ending up in the water, I needed to see what was down there. Mike Torres dove with me to about 40 feet, following the anchor line down. The water was even colder than yesterday, now reading 38 degrees. Fish that should have been everywhere were completely gone. Check this out, Mike said through his regulator, pointing at the seafloor. What I saw made no sense. Someone had arranged Timothy's pajamas on the rocks in a perfect circle. The clothes showed no tears, no signs of struggle. They looked like they'd been carefully placed there, almost like an offering. But that wasn't the strangest part. Inside the circle of clothes were shells, hundreds of them, all arranged in intricate patterns. The work was too precise, too beautiful to be random. Someone or something had spent hours creating this underwater display. We filmed everything, then surfaced to check the footage. When we played it back on the boat's small monitor, I saw something that made my hands shake. In the background of one shot, just barely visible in the murky water, was a shadow. Human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too tall, moving too smoothly through the water. It appeared for just 3 seconds before gliding away into the darkness. Did you see that? I asked Mike. He rewound the tape and watched again. See what? I pointed at the screen. But when the shadow should have appeared, there was nothing there. Just empty water. Becca, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. I ejected the tape and slipped it into my gear bag. Just tired. Let's head back. But I wasn't tired. I was terrified. Either I was losing my mind, or something was hunting children in these waters. That evening, I drove into Kotzebue to talk to Mary Kanguk, an Inupiaq elder who knew more about local folklore than anyone alive. I found her at home, working on a traditional parka. 2 children missing near the sound. I told her. Both cases involved singing voices and cold water. The families heard something calling from the sea. Mary set down her needle and looked at me with sharp, knowing eyes. Kalupalik, she said simply. I'm sorry? Kwalupalik, sea spirits. They live in the deep places and steal children. She gestured toward the water. My grandmother told me the stories. Every summer, when the ice melts, they come closer to shore. Mary, I need real answers. 2 families have lost their kids. This is real, Rebecca. Kalupalik appear as beautiful women with long black hair. They can swim faster than seals, hold their breath forever. They sing to children, make them want to come into the water. I thought about the singing both families had heard. Why do they take children? Mary's face grew sad. To replace their own babies. Kalupalik children die young in the cold deep, so they steal human children to raise as their own. That's impossible, is it? You've seen things today that don't make sense, haven't you? I hadn't told her about the underwater clothes or the shadow in the video, but somehow she knew. What happens to the children they take? I asked quietly. Some say they die quickly in the cold water. Others say Kalupalik keep them alive in underwater caves, teach them to breathe water like air. Mary picked up her sewing again. Every few years, someone sees children swimming with the Kalupalik, children who've been missing for months or years. I left Mary's house with more questions than answers, but as I drove back to my station, I made a decision. Tomorrow, I was going back down with better cameras and more air. If there were underwater caves, I was going to find them. If Emma and Timothy were still alive, I was going to bring them home. But as I pulled into my driveway, I heard it, floating across the water from somewhere far offshore. A woman's voice, singing a lullaby in a language I didn't recognize. The most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. For just a moment, I wanted to walk down to the shore, to step into the dark water and follow that voice wherever it led. Then I caught myself, ran into my cabin, and slammed the door. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that singing voice calling to me from the water. By dawn, I'd made up my mind. I was going down to those underwater caves, no matter what I found there. Dr. Anna Petrov arrived on the morning supply boat. She was a marine biologist from the University of Alaska, and I'd called her in to help explain what we were seeing. Anna was tough, practical, and skeptical of anything that couldn't be measured with instruments. "Show me this footage," she said after I'd explained the situation. We watched the dive video together on my equipment. When we got to the part where I'd seen the shadow, Anna frowned. "There," she said, pointing at the screen. "What's that?" I looked where she was pointing. The shadow was back, clear as day. Somehow, it only showed up when Anna was watching. "You can see it?" "Of course I can see it. It's right there." She rewound the tape. "Looks almost human, but the proportions are wrong. Arms too long, torso too narrow." I felt a chill of relief. I wasn't going crazy. Mike Torres joined us for the dive. We went deeper this time, following the underwater rock formations toward what looked like a cave entrance about 60 feet down. The water was so cold now that even through our thick wetsuits, we were shivering. The cave mouth was bigger than it looked from above, tall enough for a person to swim through easily. Anna went first with the underwater lights, then Mike, then me. About 30 feet into the cave, we found something impossible. Air pockets, large ones, with surfaces calm enough to reflect our lights. In a cave this deep, this far underwater, there shouldn't be any air at all. We surfaced in the first pocket, treading water in a chamber about the size of my living room. The walls were smooth, almost polished, covered in strange markings that looked like a combination of writing and pictures. "This isn't natural," Anna whispered. Her voice echoed strangely in the enclosed space. Mike was examining the wall carvings with his light. "These look old, really old, but they're too precise to be made by water erosion." That's when we heard it, children's voices, singing softly from deeper in the cave system. The same lullaby I'd heard the night before, but now I could make out English words mixed with what sounded like Inupiaq. "Emma?" I called out. "Timothy?" The singing stopped immediately. We followed the sound deeper into the cave, surfacing in pocket after pocket of impossible air. The water here was warm, actually warm, like a heated swimming pool. Bioluminescent algae on the walls gave everything a soft, green glow. In the fourth chamber, we found them. Emma Kowalski was sitting on a ledge of rock, very much alive. Her blonde hair was longer than it should be after only 3 days, flowing past her shoulders like she'd been growing it for months. She wore what looked like a dress made of woven kelp, and her skin had a faint, greenish tint in the strange light. "Emma," I called out, swimming toward her. She looked at me with eyes that seemed older than they should be. "You shouldn't be here," she said calmly. "Mother says the surface people bring danger." "Mother?" "Emma, your mother is looking for you. She's very worried." "Not that mother. My sea mother. She takes care of me now." Before I could reach her, the water around us began to move. Something large was swimming up from the depths below our chamber. Mike grabbed my arm and pointed down. Rising toward us was a woman, or something that looked like a woman from a distance. She had long, flowing black hair and pale skin. But as she got closer, I could see that her fingers were too long, ending in dark nails like claws. Gills fluttered along her neck, and her eyes reflected the green light like an animal's. "Qualipalik," I whispered. She surfaced gracefully, not even breathing hard, despite swimming up from whatever depths she'd come from. When she spoke, her voice was the same beautiful singing voice we'd been hearing. "Surface dwellers," she said in perfect English. "You must leave this place." "We're here for the children," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Emma and Timothy need to go home." "The Genma?" Kalupalik tilted her head, studying me. "Home? This is their home now. I have given them the gift of the deep waters. They will never grow old here, never know the pain of your surface world." "Emma," I called out, "don't you miss your parents?" For just a moment, the little girl's face showed confusion, longing. But then the Kalupalik sang a few soft notes, and Emma's expression went calm again. "I'm happy here," Emma said. "The water is warm, and I can swim forever." Mike was tugging on my arm, trying to pull me back toward the cave entrance, but I couldn't leave without trying to save her. "Where's Timothy?" The Kalupalik smiled, showing teeth that were too sharp. "He is learning to breathe water. Soon he will be ready to explore the deepest caves." Anna had been quiet this whole time, but now she spoke up. "How many children do you have down here?" "Not enough," the Kalupalik said sadly. "My own children died so long ago. The sea is cold and lonely without young voices." That's when I understood. This wasn't just about Emma and Timothy. This creature had been taking children for years, maybe decades. And somewhere in these caves, there might be dozens of kids who disappeared from around Kotzebue Sound. "I can't let you keep them," I said. The Kalupalik's expression hardened. "You cannot stop me, surface dweller. This is my realm." The water around us began to churn. Our air pocket started shrinking as water rose from below. Mike, Anna, and I barely had time to take deep breaths before we were pulled under by a current that felt like giant hands dragging us down. I fought my way back to the surface, gasping. Emma was gone from her ledge. The Kalupalik had vanished too. "We need to get out of here now," Mike shouted. We swam hard for the cave entrance, our lights cutting through water that seemed to be alive, pushing back against us. Something brushed against my leg. Smooth skin and long fingers. I kicked hard and felt my fins connect with something solid. We burst out of the cave and shot toward the surface, not stopping until we broke through into daylight. The three of us floated there, breathing hard and trying to process what we'd just seen. "Did that really happen?" Anna asked. Before anyone could answer, we heard a new sound from shore, screaming. A family was running along the beach, calling out a name. Another child was missing. 7-year-old Maria Santos had vanished from her family's tent sometime before dawn. Unlike the other cases, this time we found evidence of a struggle. The tent was partially collapsed, and there were wet handprints on the fabric. But the strangest part was the trail. Maria's footprints led from the tent straight into the surf, but mixed with her small tracks were larger ones. Adult-sized, but wrong somehow. The toes were too long, and there were strange marks between them like webbing. 3 children in 4 days. I said to Mike and Anna as we geared up for another dive, "This thing is getting bolder." Mary Kanguk had come down to the beach with us, bringing items she said we'd need. Traditional Inupiaq amulets and a carved whalebone knife. "Kalupalik are not evil," she explained as she handed me the knife. "But they are not human either. They think differently about right and wrong." "How do we stop them?" "You don't stop them. You make a bargain." Before I could ask what she meant, we were back underwater, diving toward the cave system. This time, we found the entrance guarded. 2 more Kalupalik floated at the mouth of the cave, their long hair drifting in the current like seaweed. They didn't try to stop us, but they followed as we swam into the cave system. I felt like we were being herded somewhere specific. The deeper chambers were different now, bigger, filled with warm, clear water and that strange green light. And they weren't empty. Children floated and played throughout the underwater rooms, dozens of them, ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers. Some looked like they'd been underwater for days, others for years. They all had that same greenish tint to their skin and hair that grew too long and moved too freely in the water, but they were breathing. Actually breathing underwater, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Dear God," Anna whispered through her regulator. "How many are there?" I counted at least 20 children in the chamber we could see, and there were passages leading to other rooms. Some of the older kids looked familiar, faces I remembered from missing person reports going back 10 or 15 years. In the center of the largest chamber, on a throne made of polished coral and whale bones, sat the oldest Kalupalik I'd seen yet. Her hair was white instead of black, and her skin was covered in intricate patterns that looked like scales. She had to be ancient. Emma, Timothy, and Maria floated near her throne, along with several other recent additions to her underwater family. The ancient Kalupalik spoke without moving her lips, her voice somehow reaching us through the water. "Surface dwellers, you have come to take my children." "They're not your children," I managed to say through my regulator. They have families who love them. Love? The creature's laugh was like whale song. I have loved them for longer than you can imagine. I have kept them safe from war, from sickness, from the cruelty of your world above. She gestured to the older children floating nearby. Ask them. Ask if they wish to return to a world that would let them grow old and die. One of the teenage boys swam forward. I recognized him from a missing person poster I'd seen years ago. David Kapianek disappeared in 1978. I remember being scared, he said, his voice carrying perfectly through the water. I remember being cold and hungry sometimes. Here, I'm never afraid. Never in pain. David, your parents never stopped looking for you, I said. His expression flickered with something that might have been sadness. My parents? Are they still alive? The ancient Qualupalik sang a soft note, and David's face went calm again. The surface world is gone for me. This is my home now. I felt sick. These children weren't just physically transformed. Their memories, their connections to their old lives had been altered somehow. Let the young ones go, I said to the ancient Kalupalik. Emma, Timothy, Maria, they haven't been here long enough. They can still remember their families. And in return, Mary had prepared me for this. What do you want? The creature smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth. One adult. Someone strong enough to survive the change, intelligent enough to help me care for the little ones. Someone who understands both worlds. She was looking directly at me. Becca, no, Mike said through his regulator. But I understood. This wasn't just about rescue anymore. It was about making a choice between the certain death of 3 young children and the unknown fate of one adult who'd volunteered to take that risk. If I stay, you let all 3 children go back to their families? The young ones, yes. The others have chosen to remain. I looked at Emma, Timothy, and Maria. They were so small, so vulnerable, their whole lives ahead of them. I need to know they'll be safe on the surface, that you won't hunt them again. The ancient Kalupalik considered this. Very well, but you must understand, once you accept the change, there is no going back. You will breathe water as easily as air, but the surface world will be lost to you forever. I thought about my life above water, 12 years as a ranger, 8 before that in the Coast Guard. I'd spent my whole adult life trying to save people from the sea. Maybe this was just the ultimate version of that job. I accept. Becca, don't do this, Anna pleaded. But I was already swimming forward, toward the throne of coral and bone. The ancient Kalupalik reached out with one clawed hand and touched my forehead. The water around us began to glow brighter, and I felt something changing inside me. My lungs didn't burn for air anymore. My skin tingled like it was growing new layers. Take the children to the surface, I told Mike and Anna. Make sure they get home safe. The last thing I saw as the transformation took hold was Emma, Timothy, and Maria swimming toward my friends, their skin already returning to its normal color as they moved away from the Kalopulik's influence. Then the warm water filled my lungs, and I discovered I could breathe it like air. 6 months have passed since I made my choice in those deep caves beneath Kotzebue Sound. The official report says that Emma Kowalski, Timothy Chen, and Maria Santos were found safely in a series of tidal pools after being lost in heavy fog. Medical examinations showed no signs of trauma, though all 3 children experienced some temporary memory loss about their time missing. I'm officially listed as missing, presumed drowned while conducting rescue operations. There was a memorial service. Mike and Anna told my story, how I died trying to save those kids. It seemed kinder than the truth. The children remember nothing of their time underwater. The Kalupalik's influence faded completely once they returned to the surface. They're back with their families now, happy and healthy and normal. Emma started kindergarten. Timothy joined a swimming club. Maria learned to ride a bicycle. They don't dream of breathing water or singing voices calling from the deep. For them, it's like it never happened. But I remember everything. Life underwater is stranger and more wonderful than I ever imagined. The ancient Kalupalik, her name is Siku, which means ice in Inupiaq, has been my teacher and guide. I've learned to swim through currents that would have killed me before, to see in the deep darkness where sunlight never reaches. The other children here aren't prisoners. They're family. David, who I met that first day, has been here for over 40 years but still looks 17. He teaches the younger ones about life above water, helps them remember their humanity even as they adapt to this new existence. There are rules, I've learned. Natural laws that even the Kalupalik must follow. Children can be changed because they're still growing, still becoming who they'll be. Adults usually die in the transformation, their bodies and minds too set in surface ways. I survived because I chose it freely, because I came with love instead of fear. Every few years, Siku chooses carefully, a child who's already lost, already hurting, already halfway between the surface world and somewhere else. Not every missing child ends up here. Only the ones who need saving in ways their families couldn't provide. I think about that sometimes, about the ethics of it. Are we kidnappers or rescuers? The honest answer is probably both, depending on the child, depending on the circumstances. It's not as simple as right or wrong when you're dealing with creatures who measure time in centuries and think in terms of species survival rather than individual choice. Mike visits sometimes. He's learned to dive deeper than regulations allow, following the secret routes Siku showed me to the shallower chambers where air breathers can survive. He brings news from the surface, updates on the families. Anna published a paper about previously unknown sea caves in Arctic waters. She's mapped our entire system without ever revealing its true purpose or inhabitants. The official explanation for the underwater air pockets is unusual geological formations creating natural diving bells. Mary Kanguk passed away last month. At 93, she died peacefully in her sleep. Mike brought me the news, along with something she'd wanted me to have, a traditional Inupiaq parka that her grandmother had made. She said you'd understand why you needed it, Mike told me. I did understand. Even underwater, even transformed, I'm still part of the human world. The parka reminds me where I came from, helps me remember why I'm here. Sometimes, late at night in the deepest chambers, I wonder if I made the right choice. Whether saving 3 children was worth becoming something that's no longer quite human, whether the kids I'm helping to raise now will thank me when they're adults, or blame me for the lives they'll never have on the surface. But then Emma's little brother starts learning to walk, and David teaches him to swim before he can talk, and Maria finds a perfect shell to add to her collection. And I remember, these children are loved. They're safe. They're growing up in a world where no one will ever hurt them. That has to count for something. The ocean around, Kotzebue Sound runs deeper and stranger than any map shows. There are cities down here, ancient and beautiful, built by creatures that humans call myths. There are wonders that surface dwellers will never see, never even imagine. And there are children, human children with gills and webbed fingers and hearts that still beat with the rhythms they learned before they were born. Children who will never grow old, never know war or hunger, or the 1,000 small cruelties that the surface world offers. I'm their guardian now, their bridge between what they were and what they're becoming. It's not the life I planned, but it's the life I chose. Every evening, as the sun sets somewhere far above us, I swim to the highest chamber and sing the old lullabies, some in English, some in Inupiaq, some in languages older than either. The children gather around to listen, and for a while, we're just a family telling stories before bedtime. And if sometimes a lost child hears that singing and follows it down into the warm, safe darkness, well, that's not always a tragedy. Sometimes it's a rescue.